to do that will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to buy the like button in order of their favorite food, fried chicken, but before you give it to them, remove the outer crispy layer from all of the pieces. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
What's up, everybody?
My first time camping with friends by the Angry Chicken Lady. You can call me Alice. I'm currently 25 and live in Essex, England. I was 19 when, in April 2012, my male best friend invited me to go camping with him, along with a workmate that he fancied and some of her friends. I knew the main reason for him inviting me was because I could drive, but he was also my close friend, and I got along well with his friends that I'd met, so I said I was game. Even when I discovered my ex and his new girlfriend would be there, I was still excited, as they were both genuinely nice people, and there were no negative feelings. When the time came, we loaded up in my tiny old Nova and my ex's car, and we set off to the New Forest. Our drive was long. We even had a good laugh after we turned up at the wrong campsite, and we finally rolled into the right place. We stayed Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night to drive home on Monday. Friday and Saturday went by undramatically, and we had great fun exploring the area and having barbecues, etc. We decided not to set up in the open field area with loads of tents and noise, opting instead for a clearing edged by trees on 3 sides. Just down this tree-lined stony lane, maybe 800 yards off the main field. There were 2 other camps down there, spaced far apart from each other. Probably other people after some peace and quiet like we were. The rest of my group really ballsed up at setting up the tent and airbeds, so they ended up freezing night after night, lying only a few millimeters away from liquid mud. But that's camping in England during the spring for you. As for me, I slept in my car each night, despite my achy back. On Sunday morning, I groggily creaked out of my car, grabbing my wash bag and toiletries, and started to totter off to the loos, which are at the top of the treeless slope. Suddenly, a short, chubby man comes waddling down the lane. He sees me and starts to walk around my car. He looks absolutely livid. I made brief eye contact with him, and I saw the rage in his eyes. I assumed he's something to do with one of the other camps behind us. It's too early for that kind of stuff, so I looked away and continued on. Then I hear him shout, but I can't hear him due to my tinnitus. He wasn't super close just yet, so he shouts again, this time getting my attention, and he speeds up toward me. "You can all get out right now before I call the police. You're not welcome here." I stop and blink. What's he on about? He continues shouting, gaining attention from all the camps now. He starts raving on about me driving donuts around the mini roundabout near the reception, for speeding up and down the road that runs down the camping fields, then lists more dangerous driving offenses, considering it was 7 a.m. and I literally just woke up. I was speechless. I tried to maintain composure and politeness, despite his intimidating approach, and explained that it could not have been me. but he insists that it had to only have been this car, saying that there's no other cars here like it.
Is it?
I turn defiantly and firmly shout to him,
Hello?
"Fine, touch the bonnet." We both touch the hood of the car at the same time, and of course it was gratifyingly cool to the touch. "See," I said, "if I'd been speeding around like you claim, the engine would be hot and the metal bonnet would be heated. It wasn't me." His lip curled as he stared at the bonnet for nearly a minute, his hand still resting there as if trying to find some source of heat. In his eyes, I could see him realizing that I was correct. With a flounce and a mumbled word warning me about if he catches me again, he stormed off back up the lane. No one knew how to react to him, and the whole clearing had an atmosphere for a while. No one even recognized him as part of the staff, and he didn't wear a uniform. That was just the start of a very awful trip. On the final day there, we shook off the incident, and soon the entire campground had a particularly cheery atmosphere as the evening was nice. The smells of barbecues all over and ale hung everywhere. At about 1 a.m., the others retired to their tent, and I laid back in the front passenger seat for another achy rest. This time I left the window half rolled up while I wound down for the night and enjoyed the bliss of nature. It was pretty dark in our clearing. I started to drift off, enjoying the cool breeze rolling through thanks to the window. Suddenly, a long, terrible scream fills the air, and everything seems to turn to ice in an instant. I freeze in my sleeping bag, shocked and waiting for something else to happen. Then I hear a wailing sound, terrible, pitiful, shrieking twice more before stopping. I shiver in my seat, paralyzed. Gradually, I very slowly extend my hand and roll my window up, confirming that all the doors are locked. I sat still for a very long time, twitching when I saw movement rustling amongst the trees on the far side of the clearing. My eyes darted around, waiting to see some lunatic come running out of God knows where. Silence fell over the camp, the atmosphere tense and heavy. Somehow, I managed to fall asleep. It may not have even been that long afterwards. I had no clock for reference, and only realized I fell asleep when I woke up again. I checked my phone when I was awake and saw that it was 4:15 in the morning. I peered forward to see what had awoken me. There was a helicopter flying over the woods, casting a beam of light here and there. A police car was parked not too far from us, and when I cracked my window open, I could hear the sounds of more vehicles in the distance. Something was going on. I decided to stay in my car, not sure what to do. We texted amongst each other. I explained what was going on that I could see, and we all settled on packing up early. Yet leaving took ages. When we finally emerged from the stony lane, we found the site to be crawling with more police, and no one was allowed to leave until they had answered several questions. All they told us was that someone had perished, and they needed any information available. I told them about the screams, and the rest had nothing to add, having slept through it. Eventually, we were allowed to leave. We decided to drive straight home, the atmosphere quiet and somber. This wasn't aided by me accidentally taking the wrong direction on the M25 and lengthening the already miserable journey. We later found out what happened. A large family had gone away for a big birthday weekend and thrown a barbecue at their campout. They were in the same camping area as us. When a little girl got sleepy, her family tucked her up in their tent and went back to their barbecue. Her mother got concerned that the daughter would get cold, so she put the used barbecue in the tent to keep her warm. When they checked in on her a few hours later, she had asphyxiated and sadly passed away. The screams we had heard that night were from her mother just discovering the lifeless body of her little girl. And to this day, it chills my blood when I think about it. Sometimes it comes unbidden to my mind, the terrible sound of raw, painful emotion, and unimaginable horror. The New Forest is a wonderful and magical place to visit, and this experience didn't spoil it for me. But whenever I'm reminded of the New Forest, my mind always wanders to that little girl and her family. 2. The Friendly Campers by Zach. It was about a year ago. Me and my friends, a bunch of college students, had an affinity for road trips. It's just another form of escapism for us. As college goes, our bank accounts stopped accommodating trips around the East Coast, so we took up camping instead. My best friend owns this land a few hours east of Scranton, Pennsylvania. We all elected to take this big camping trip by the end of the summer, and we spent a while preparing. When the time came, we divided ourselves into 2 cars, split tents, food, drinks, and everything else among us. As we came close to the destination, our GPS went out, so we relied on physical maps we brought with us. After an hour, we arrived at the campsite at just about dusk. We unloaded all of our stuff, set up our tents, and built a nice bonfire. We delegated bonfire duty to one person, and by God, he kept it lit the whole day. The first night was fun. I got over the creepy ambience of being in the middle of nowhere after 5 or 6 beers. We exchanged stories, pranked each other, and soon went to bed. On the second day, a group of my friends decided they were going to make the 2-hour drive to some hick town in order to get more firewood and snacks. I was in the group that stayed behind. According to them, they ended up getting lost in the morning fog and found themselves at the local store sometime after sunrise. After purchasing their stuff, they encountered a ragged old man in the parking lot, your archetypal hillbilly, as hick as you can get on the eastern seaboard. He asks for a cigarette. They oblige, and then begins to berate them with questions. Stuff like, "What's your name? Where are you from? What are you doing here?" To that latter question, he was very interested. He asks where we're camping, and if he could stop by. They think he's joking and laugh, but he insists. He says he'll hang out with us, and doesn't drop the subject, even as they are entering their car. By then, they're all too high to notice the guy hopping into his beaten-up pickup truck. They don't find out they're being followed until they leave the paved roads and see him following them onto the dirt trails leading back to the campsite. Again, I attribute this to them being high, but they still kept going back to the campsite. They said that they had no room to turn around and nowhere to go. But hey, leading this guy back was not a good idea. The whole time, I'm just sitting at the fire smoking and have no idea it's happening because of the absence of cell service in the area. When I see them rushing back hours late, I say, "Oh, come on, where are the snacks at? Where's breakfast?" They make a jumbled recounting of this guy that followed them miles back. At first, I think they're just pranking, but the fear plastered onto their faces was obvious. They say he parked the car about 40 feet behind theirs and watched them get out. I get the rest of us together, and we all decide to confront this guy. So it turns out he was coming first. We're walking the 20-minute walk to the cars, and as we see this dirty old man in the clearing, we see that he's holding a hunting rifle. We weren't going to try and make a break for it, or see what the guy wanted, so we decided to loop back around to the camp, and then try to make a wide arc to avoid him. So we get back to the camp in half the time it took us to walk there, and began frantically packing our essentials in a high stupor. As we're about to turn around and go, my friend points out that the bonfire is giving off a lot of smoke on account of all the leaves we used for kindling. So it's assumed that the guy can figure out exactly where we were. We stop our packing process immediately and dip into the trees, running with reckless abandon to cover as much ground as possible. As we're reaching the car, we then hear gunshots in the direction of the camp. We get into our car and floor it out of there. After a 2-hour drive back into town, we reach a police station. We submit our report, even though we were clearly under the influence. They hold us at the station and send a car out to investigate. We're sitting around, freaking out, more over the consequences of going to the cops high, rather than being scared of the maniac. It's late in the afternoon before the car returns and tells us what they found. The tents were shredded up and had shell casing and bullet holes in them. So, no, he wasn't just hunting out there and we had gotten it all wrong. Aside from the food wrappers, they said barely anything else was left behind. From our own accounting, the guy took our weed, our keg of beer, but also my friend's wallet. We tell the police the latter, and he says they'll continue to search around, but they didn't find any cars around. We ended up going home early. My friend had to cancel his debit card and get a new ID, and we all haven't heard of anything since. Of course, the knowledge is still haunting us that this psychopath knows who he is, and roughly where he lives. I'm sure nothing will come of it. Nothing has, and it's been a year. But I have no idea what this guy's intentions with us were. Why did he follow us all the way out there? Why did he shoot up our stuff? If we had remained, would we be filled with holes as well? We haven't been back to that camping site since, but we do plan on returning this summer. It's June, and we're going back in August, completely sober this time. We're going to see what came of this, if the case is even still open. Wish us luck. 3. Best Camping Trip by Matthias. The story starts with my cousin Mick calling my sister to ask if she would give him a ride to a campsite in Nagal, New Mexico. He asked her if she wanted to go with him, and she said yes, but she asked if I could go as well. I was excited, as this was going to be my first real camping trip. Mick's sons were coming as well. They were Nick and Barry. My sister has a truck with a big bed, so me, Nick, and Barry sat in the back on the way over. When we arrived, we started putting up the tents. We had gotten there at about 5:32 p.m., and it gets dark here at about 6, so by the time we had things set up and were gathering wood for the fire, it was dark. After a bit of talking, me and Nick decided to sit in the bed of the truck and talk there. Barry joined us a little while after. Meanwhile, Mick and my sister Shay go get more wood for the fire. When they were gone and the three of us were talking, we began to hear branches breaking or being moved in the woods. We thought it was my sister and Mick. Perhaps they had turned, and they were coming in our direction now. But then we noticed the flashlight they had been using. The beam was coming on the opposite side of us, not from the direction of these noises. Being curious teens, the three of us thought we had to go and see what this was. We grabbed our own flashlights and went towards it. We looked around for a while, getting deeper and deeper into the woods by the second. I was so focused and intent on finding something that I didn't realize I had lost sight of Nick and Barry. I was going to yell for them, but just before I could, Nick screamed. His shoulder was bleeding. Due to the darkness, I didn't see it at first, but when it moved, there was a slight blur to it, and I saw it. Some sort of pale animal. I shone my flashlight at it, and either it had no eyes, or its eyes were too dark to see, even with me shining my light on it. Its mouth was a triangular shape. When my light hit it, it cowered away. It opened its odd-looking mouth and screamed. A sound burst from it, something akin to a lion's roar, mixed with the sounds of a woman in pain. I grabbed Nick, pulling him back away from the creature and helping him stand up. He was latching at his shoulder, trying to cover his wound. As I continued to shine the creature in its eyes, it scurried away, its movements like some sort of glitched-out insect. Back at camp, Barry was already there. Mick and Shay were coming out of the woods, wondering what the heck was going on, as they had heard Nick scream. After seeing Nick's wound, we knew we had to get out of there. We packed up fast and got Nick to a hospital. Nick was fine after a lot of stitches. We tried to call the cops about it, but we were told they couldn't do anything, that we might have better luck with the game warden or the forest service. All in all, no matter what we did, nothing came of it. I guess all I can really say here is if you find yourself in the woods of Nagal, New Mexico at night, be careful and pray that you brought something to protect yourself with. 4. The Camping Creep and His Friends by Hannah. It was a random weekend in 2016. 2 of my friends and I decided to go camping. We were all 16 to 17 years old at the time. I'm from a small town in Iowa, so there's really not much to do. Camping was our best option to have some fun without parents. We got to the campsite around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were all set up by 3:30 or 4-ish. A little background about this place. There's a pretty decent-sized body of water, and it's surrounded by 60 feet of rock around the entire thing. When you climb the rock, on the other side of the trail there is a wooded area. It's actually quite beautiful, and a lot of young couples would go up to the top of the cliff and do their thing, because they thought it was romantic up there. It was a popular place to go, but this weekend there wasn't as many people as usual. We had made a fire, and we were all sitting around it. To the left of us, there was a camper full of about 5 people. They looked like your typical potheads, but we didn't think anything of it. We had a lot of those kinds of people in this area, and we were used to it. I would glance over occasionally, because I would feel eyes on me from over there. Specifically, there was a man who seemed to be in his mid-30s, and I caught him staring at me a few times, and not in a very friendly way. I felt like he was undressing me with his eyes, and it made me very uncomfortable. Keep in mind, I was a 16-year-old young girl at the time, and this guy was obviously way older than me. It was creepy and unsettling. My 2 friends were a couple. Lily and Will were their names. At one point, they decided to take a walk for some alone time. I was left at the tent by myself, with those 5 weirdos to the left of me. I didn't really want to stay at the tent alone anymore, so I decided to grab my fishing pole and go try to catch some fish. I walked on down to the water. I was down there for about 10 minutes when I began to hear footsteps coming up from behind me. I turned around, and there was that weird, creepy guy who had been staring at me from earlier. I figured he probably wanted to go fishing or something, but then I noticed he didn't have a pole or any equipment. Up close, his eyes were even more crazy looking, and I could tell that his intentions were not pure. I immediately became uneasy, and I tried to think quickly. But he randomly said to me, "What's your name?" I hesitated, not really sure if I should give this man my real name, but I didn't want to have him mad at me, so I told him, Hannah. I tried to mind my own business and continue fishing, but he continued to try to talk to me. I would give him one-word answers like, yeah, okay, cool. The conversation lasted about 5 minutes before he started getting really weird. He was asking me if I was a virgin, if I liked it rough, and if I liked being choked. At that point, I knew I had to get out of there, so I said loud and clear, "Piss off," and I grabbed my fishing pole and my tackle box. I started walking back to the tent. Yet the guy continued to follow me up there. He did go back to his camper. He sat beside his friends, and he stared. I set my stuff in the tent and looked over at the camper, because I still felt watched, and of course I was right. But now they were all staring at me. 2 of them waved, so I gave them all the finger, yet they only laughed at me and continued to stare. I walked in the same direction Lily and Will went. I didn't care if I interrupted their fun time. I was freaked out, and they should not have left me alone. All those strangers, they gave off a bad vibe. I once again heard footsteps behind me after a couple of minutes of walking, and I knew exactly who it was. I knew that if I ran, he could probably catch up to me. I wasn't the fastest or the most in shape. I walked faster until I got to a point where there were two ways that I could go. I went right, hoping my friends did too. I started to speed up more. I was hoping that Lily and Will were at the romantic spot on the top of the cliff. On the way up there were a lot of holes and big rocks in the trail, and it was hard to keep a quick pace. I looked behind me, and he was only 10 feet away now. I called out to him, "Why the heck are you following me?" He looked back and only smiled, revealing crooked, dirty teeth. He began to move quicker towards me, so I booked it. It was all uphill and my legs were killing me, but I could hear him gaining on me still. I was going as fast as I possibly could, and I ended up tripping over a tree root that was coming out of the ground. I got up quickly and continued to run, but not quick enough. He grabbed me by my ponytail and pulled me backward, making me fall right on my back and hitting my head hard on the ground. I was dazed. I slowly tried to get up, but he was in front of me. "Move, or there's going to be hell to pay," I told him. Honestly, I don't know why I did that. It was definitely not the best idea, but I wanted him to know that I wasn't scared to put up a fight. His smile faded, and he got on my face wide-eyed with an insane look, saying, "Who do you think you're talking to, little girl?" He grabbed me by my neck and put me up against a tree. I was so scared, but all I could do was fight back. I kneed him in the groin and pushed him over into what looked like a ditch of poison ivy. I hope it was. I continued to run. I soon saw Will standing up. I called his name. He looked over to me, confused. I caught up to him, and I was so out of breath and scared, and as I was crying, he probably couldn't understand me very well, but I managed to tell them what had happened. Will decided to go confront the guy. He was pretty big, Will. He was about 6'2" and was a farm boy, so I had confidence in him. Lily and I stayed up on the cliff for a while. We eventually went back down after I chilled out. When we arrived back at the tent, the creep and his creepy friends were gone. I asked Will what he did. Apparently, he had told them that he had some heavy firepower in the tent, and he wasn't afraid to use it. He didn't actually have anything, but as he was outnumbered, he figured lying would be a good idea. And all that matters is that it worked. Throughout the remainder of the weekend, I couldn't get that experience out of my head, and my throat was bruised. 5. The Camp Stalker by John. One sunny day, my friends and I thought it would be a great idea to go camping. I packed my clothes and iPad, and I was on my way to meet my friends at the campsite. When I got there, I noticed that one of them had brought their dog. I asked him why, and his reply was odd. I could not tell if he was trying to scare me or not, because he himself also looked very frightened as he said it. Because something in the woods. I was sure that he was just telling a joke. I went ahead and got the tent set up with my friend, who I referred to as Jax. At around 11 p.m., we were still up. We were telling stories around the campfire. Suddenly, his dog went absolutely crazy, barking aggressively in every direction. I told Jax to go check it out, and he said it's nothing nervously, and we resumed telling stories and making marshmallows. We went to sleep at about 12:34 p.m. I woke up to the sound of barking and growling. I told the dog to be quiet, but that didn't do anything. Frustrated, I raised out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent. I poked my head out and I looked around, trying to figure out what in the world he was barking at. It didn't take long. There was a large silhouette of someone standing next to the trees, and they were extremely tall, their head going past some of the branches on the trees. I freaking lost it and screamed, waking up Jax and telling him to run. We didn't pack up anything. Instead, we rode back to my house as fast as possible. I don't know who or what it was that was watching us sleeping in our tents, but I think this experience has ruined camping for me. 6. Man in the Campsite by Eglay. My older sister had a part-time job as a camp counselor in Lithuania, and she invited me to visit it at least once. I didn't really want to go, as it was a camp for vegetarians, but I did want to spend some time with my sister and a few other friends that would be attending. On the first 2 days, nothing really much happened. At night, I only heard a few branches snapping or leaves rustling, attributing the noise to squirrels or nighttime animals. On the 3rd day, I got really bored and irritable. There was nothing to do, and I was getting hungry for actual food. I went back to the campsite. I was supposed to be back at the game area, or helping the kitchen with lunch, but I was rebellious and decided to do my own thing. I lay down and started to read a book. Pretty soon, it became difficult to continue reading, because someone would not stop rustling around in their tent next to me. At first, I thought it may have been a female counselor searching for something, but the rustling continued for around 5 more minutes. I got eager to see what was going on, so I unzipped my tent, and I poked my head out to look at the direction of the person. It was a clear day, so I saw who was there. It wasn't one of the other kids. It was a man. I thought maybe he was a male counselor. But all the counselors have colorful uniforms and boots to be recognized with. Yet this man was wearing camo pants with a leather jacket. I think that he heard me zipping the tent, because he stopped rustling and crawled backwards out of it. I quickly crawled back into mine and zipped up the entrance. I was breathing pretty heavily, so I covered my mouth with my hand. Then the footsteps started. They were coming right around toward my tent. I think that he didn't know where I was, since we were in a cluster of other tents. I saw his shadow, though, walking right past my tent. And thanks to his silhouette, I saw that he appeared to be carrying an axe. I mean, not a hatchet, but a big tree-cutting axe. Thankfully, he walked right past my tent. I waited a good while before unzipping the entrance just a little bit, just to see my surroundings. There were only trees and tents, just like before. The man was gone. I stepped out slowly, being cautious still, yet I still didn't see anyone around. I went to check the path the man had walked. There were some boot prints on moss. They were huge. I went over to check the tent he was looking around in. The girl that owned that tent, her clothes were scattered around inside. Her backpack was unzipped, and the entrance was left open. Something tells me the girl hadn't left her clothes like this. I ran to the fireplace as fast as I could and told the counselors what happened. They looked worried, and we hurried back there. I showed them the boot prints in the tent. The owner of the tent soon realized that several pieces of her underwear and clothes were missing. Even after what happened, the counselors still wanted us to stay in the camp and asked us not to call the parents just yet. That was a bunch of bull to me. Safety should be top priority, and if there was some crazy guy walking around with an axe, none of the kids should still be here. For the rest of the time I was there, I didn't leave my sister's side because I was terrified of that man coming back. Yet nobody saw the man again, and nobody else's personal things were taken after that. But I can tell you for sure that I'm not going back to that camp.
This will do that.
7. Massachusetts Skinwalker by Aaron. It was the early 2010s. I was around 7 years old. I was in my backyard camping, since I've never been camping before, and my parents thought it would be fun and cute to let me camp in the backyard. They even joined me. After a fun night around the campfire, it's time to hit the sack. We crawled into the tent and quickly dozed off. But something in the middle of the night woke me up. I had to use the bathroom really bad. I crawled over to my mom and rubbed her shoulder lightly, saying that I needed to go pee. She grumbled and told me to go outside near the tree. I did as she told me and steadily walked over to the tree outside the tent. As I did my business, I remember being nervous for two reasons. One, it was very dark, and at that age I was afraid of it. And two, all of the sounds I had fallen asleep to, night birds and insects, they had gone silent, as if they'd disappeared. But soon, a noise did interrupt the silence. At first, I thought it was my mom calling me, but it wasn't coming from the tent. It was coming from in front of me, where the hedge and the metal fence met. It was calling to me. I ended up turning back and forth, looking at the hedge, then back to the tent, wondering what was going on. Did I not just crawl over my mom to get out of the tent? Who was talking to me? As I looked at the hedge more closely, I managed to make out a figure standing there. A figure whose skin was wrinkled every inch, as if withered away by hundreds of years of age. And I saw its mouth move, and my mother's voice came out. That's when I screamed. I ran back to the tent, and surprisingly, no one had been awakened by my screaming. I huddled up close to my mother, and I closed my eyes, trying to pretend that I was just sleeping. A few hours later, I was saved by the sunrise. Groggily, I helped my parents clean up. I never again asked my parents to camp out in the backyard. Even when they thought it'd be fun and asked me, I refused. But I never told them what I saw, because I don't know what I saw. 8. National Forest Monster by Abner S. I really loved the summertime, so when summer arrived in 2005, I was already starting to plan a little overnight camping trip in a national forest, only a couple towns away from where I live. I always go alone, and this would be my first time going to that specific national forest. I guess with this trip I was unprepared, because while getting there, I had realized that I forgot to bring a ground cover for my tent, since I didn't use a tent with a built-in ground cover at the time. Plus, I forgot some other small things. I was already more than halfway to the forest, so I said screw it, and kept on going. It was going to be night soon anyway. Things only got worse when I encountered a ton of traffic on the highway, throwing me a couple of hours off schedule. On my way there, I kept glancing at the sky and looking at the sunset. It was already getting dark. After around 20 minutes of driving from the exit, I got to the mountains, and there was nothing but trees on either side of the road, so I thought that I was already in the park. I did think to myself for a split moment how it was weird that I never saw any entrance signs, but my main focus was trying to find a good spot, any spot, to camp for the night. After 20 more minutes of driving through pure forest, the road turned to gravel, and I thought to myself, this has to be some sort of camping area, right? Looking back, I should have turned right there, but I was exhausted and tired of driving. I finally settled on parking near a clearing on a dirt path, and I set up my camp there. When I got out of my truck, things seemed pretty normal. The only thing out of place at the time was that there were no other sounds except for the crickets and the sound of me setting up my camp. There was no wind, no frogs, owls, or any other people. Just me and the crickets. It was already getting late by that point, a little past 9, so I had my dinner, sat around the campfire for a little bit, then climbed into the tent to sleep. I found myself awakened. I checked my watch and it was 11:15. I thought I woke up because the bare ground had made my back stiff, but my back felt fine. I came to the conclusion that I just woke myself up randomly, so I closed my eyes and tried to get back to sleep. But then I heard a deep, raspy far in the distance. I sat right up. What in the world was that? I thought to myself. That didn't seem like a howl or a growl of any animals I knew. I went back down in my sleeping bag, desperately thinking to myself a logical explanation as to what that sound was. Maybe it was an owl being killed by a wolf or something. I don't know. After around 2 minutes of trying to fall back to sleep, I was immediately jolted straight awake by the same sound, this time right next to the wall of my tent. In pure shock, I immediately jolted up, bust out the front of my tent, and ran straight in the opposite direction of where the thing was. I didn't look back, and I didn't even catch a glimpse of whatever it was. I was running for only a couple of seconds when I slipped down a hill. Keep in mind, I was barefoot and in pajamas. I tumbled for a few seconds, and then, once I stopped, I tried to keep as motionless as possible. Maybe the thing didn't see me fall, I thought. I didn't want to give away where I was lying. I listened. There was nothing. I waited a little longer, but still nothing. I slowly peeked over the hill, trying to see as much of my campsite as I could in the dark, but I could not see any of it. While doing this, I noticed that the crickets were now quiet as well. It was just pure silence. I didn't hear any leaves crunching either. It seemed to be all clear. That I was able to make a beeline for my tent to grab my pack bag, which had some miscellaneous stuff in my wallet in it, but most importantly, my keys. I knew I'd have to do it quick. So I tried to get to my car as fast as possible, while making the least amount of noise. Every time I stepped on a leaf or twig, I cringed. I successfully got the bag and started opening it, ever so slightly to get my keys. Once I got the keys, I went over to the car, unlocked it, and ignited it. Once I did this, I started to floor it out of there. I knew I shouldn't have done what I was going to do next, but I took one look back at the tent. Crouching down right beside the tent was the thing. Even in the darkness, I could make out its features. Its eyes were completely black, body covered with short white hair, and the overall body structure was barely that of a person. I knew it saw me, because once it did, the creature let out that horrific sound again, that all too familiar. I punched the gas pedal on my car. I didn't stop until I got to a hotel far away from the forest. I got a room and immediately collapsed into the bed, exhausted. I had a nightmare that night of the creature looking at me through the hotel window, slowly and steadily letting out that horrific sound. I jolted awake to the sound of nothing but my own heavy breathing and the crickets outside. Now, this may have been paranoia, but I think, sitting in that hotel room, trying to fall asleep again, I think I may have heard that discernible screech off in the distance. 9. The Camping Skinwalker by B. Bow. It was May 27th, 2008. It was a Thursday when this happened to us. It was my 12th birthday, and my mom decided to book a 5-day forest camping trip. I've always loved camping, and I needed some fresh air from playing too much PS3. I arrived with no problems apart from forgetting my spare trousers. On Monday, we did some archery, and on Tuesday we went rock climbing, and on Wednesday we made little boats and saw if they would float. Every night we'd hang out around the campfire and sing songs, make s'mores, and play Chinese whispers. On Thursday, things changed. I woke up that night to see that Andrew and Callum, 2 people in my tent, were gone. I unzipped the tent to investigate. I listened closely. Then I heard it. It sounded like Callum, and he was screaming for Stan. Terrified, I zipped my tent back up, and I laid down, covering myself with my sleeping bag. Later on that night, Callum and Stan never returned, but I did see an oddly tall shadow walking around my tent extremely slowly. I don't think that was a counselor. The next day, I reported it to the counselors that Andrew and Callum were still missing. There was a search party, and they ended up finding the two boys huddled together in the forest under a makeshift shelter. They were shivering and scared and complaining about coyotes, even though we're not supposed to have those here. It was definitely strange. I just wish I knew what they had seen that night. And 10. Ghost Girl in the Cabin by Mayamu. When I was in school, every year the 6th graders went on a week-long camping trip to the coast. It's called 6th grade camp, and it was really fun. That year, my class went down to Mendocino to stay the week in the woods next to the coast. Everybody got split up into groups of 3 to share a cabin. So my 2 friends, Emma and Lauren, and I got set up in a cabin named Cabin 1. Everything was great. The cabin was small, but it was well kept for the most part. We had a rule, though, that when one of us had to use the restroom, we would have to wake up another person to go with us, a sort of bathroom buddy, because the woods were very creepy at night, and the bathroom was a long hike up the hill. One night, I was awakened by the sound of footsteps coming from the back of the cabin to the front, where my bed was situated. They just kept going back and forth really loudly, so I thought it was one of the girls who needed to use the restroom. Maybe she was debating which one of us to wake up, or if she even had the guts to wake one of us up. I listened for a bit, confused and waiting for someone to speak up and ask if we wanted to go to the bathroom with her. But there was just silence, just footsteps going back and forth. I decided to look up from my pillow, and what I saw scared me half to death. It was a little girl dressed in a nightgown, standing over my bed. She was looking down at me. At first, I thought it was Emma, because she kind of looked like her. Short, curly blonde hair and a small round face. But then I remembered, Emma wasn't wearing a nightgown. I was petrified. I pulled my head under my blanket and prayed for it to go away. I fell asleep eventually, too scared to uncover at all. The next day, I asked Emma if she had gotten up last night at all, and she gave me a really confused look, saying no. That day we found a really old family photo stuffed in the rafters of the ceiling. In it, there was a little girl with blonde curly hair. I don't know if she died here in the camp, or if that was even a ghost at all, or a demon pretending to be a little girl. Either way, it scared the absolute crap out of me. Bigfoot in West Texas, from Choi 2719. Back in 2013, I was in a Boy Scout camping trip in Northwest Texas. I'd barely turned 13, which was the minimum age to register for high adventure programs. I accepted a particular challenge of hiking 7 miles away from the base camp to a secluded camping location surrounded by mountains. I need to address the fact that we were really secluded out there. Our only source of light was the moon, and a couple of flashlights. In addition, the program was a historical reenactment of Texas ranchers from the 1800s, which meant the camping spot had a small corral with 2 goats and a few hens. I felt somewhat safe as we were only 7 scouts and 3 staff members. Safety in numbers, right? If we had any medical emergencies, it would be an hour wait for an ATV to reach the campsite, and another hour for that ATV to reach base camp. To make things sound worse, the fact that the campsite was in between the mountains, that meant we did not have any cell phone signal. The first few days were very uneventful. We just worked on merit badges and swam in the river. The second night was when all hell broke loose. I woke up at around 1 in the morning to go use the outhouse. I tried to wake up my buddy, but he just told me to stop being scared as he covered his face back up with his sleeping bag. So I grabbed my flashlight and took the 20-meter walk to the outhouse. As I was walking, the goats were making these sounds. This only put me further on edge. It's weird how creepy goats can be at night. I entered the outhouse, and while I was doing my business,
I heard small objects hitting the wooden structure. I took out my Swiss Army pocket knife and, trying to sound as intimidating as possible, I said, "Julian, cut it out." But I did not hear a response. Instead, I heard loud footsteps roaming around the outhouse. I turned off my light and prayed that whoever or whatever was outside would just leave me alone. After 8 extremely long minutes passed, I could no longer hear the footsteps. Even so, I stayed inside that outhouse for 10 more minutes, just to be safe. After those extra 10 minutes of nothing, I slowly opened the wooden door. I scanned my surroundings, but there was nothing out of the ordinary in my perimeter. I took a deep breath and swallowed. Then I booked it back to my tent, then covered myself in my sleeping bag. I could not sleep all night, and once the sun came up, I asked Julian, "Hey, nice try, but it's going to take more than a couple of rocks to scare me." Julian looked up at me, giving me this weird look, and said, "What do you mean, dude? I didn't leave the tent all night." Confused and worried, I began to wonder who could have been outside that outhouse. There was no way it wasn't someone playing a prank on me or trying to tease me as I used the bathroom. The following 2 days went by very fast, and at last it was the day to pack up camp and hike back to base camp. But the scoutmaster woke everyone up at 3 a.m. For some reason, he kept rushing all of us to pack only what we could carry, and ATV could come get the rest of the stuff later. An older scout asked why we had to leave 6 hours early. The scoutmaster responded, "You don't want to hike when it's 90 out, do you?" We all agreed. We then began our hike back to base camp. The scoutmaster and staff began to hurry us even more, jogging on the trail now. Being the youngest and the smallest, I was lagging behind to the point that I was alone on the trail. I stopped to catch my breath, and that's when I heard a sound that I will never forget. It was a whooping sound, echoing through the mountains. I whispered under my breath, "The hell is that?" Then I heard another whoop. I burst into a run down the trail, desperate to catch up with my peers. As I ran, I could hear footsteps that sounded like the ones that I heard when I was defenseless in that outhouse. I shone my flashlight to the surrounding woods. 2 amber eyes shone back at me. I thought my fear was taking the best out of me, but then I saw the eyes getting closer and closer. Then they blinked. I screamed, running down the trail, hearing occasional whooping sounds a good distance away behind me. After running for 6 minutes straight, I caught up with the troop who were wondering where I'd been. I asked the others, Did you guys hear those sounds?" Before anyone could speak, the scoutmaster sternly told us, "Stay quiet, you boys. You need to conserve your breathing. We have another 4 miles left to reach base camp." I nodded, and I kept walking with them, this time making sure to keep pace with them no matter what. We reached the base camp at around 8 a.m. The campers stared at us as we all looked like we had seen a ghost. I slept in a cafeteria chair for about 3 hours until some ATVs flew by with some hiking bags. I recognized my black High Sierra backpack. I went to wake up my troop to pick up their bags. It turns out, when we reached the base camp, the scoutmaster asked some of the staff members to help pick up our belongings. As I went to thank the staff members for helping pick up our gear, one of them looked at me very pale. He had walked away from the ATV and went right to the main office. After leaving our gear at the cafeteria, my troop as well as the staff members were called into the main office. Once we shut the door, the main scoutmaster told us, "You boys were really brave getting out of your comfort zone in the mountains. Just be careful with mountain lions. They normally don't attack humans, but it is best to take precautions. Please do not tell anyone about this trip. We don't want the Scout organization to lose membership over a territorial mountain lion. We all responded with a quick yes, sir, then walked out of the office without saying another word. Since one of our scouts had a merit badge that needed to be completed at base camp, we decided to spend the night here. Even if I was now surrounded by more than 300 scouts, I still felt uneasy about being out in the woods. That night, we had permission to sleep in the cafeteria, as the staff members weren't able to get our tents back yet. I still didn't feel safe there, not even with 4 walls surrounding me. I just wanted to get back to civilization. At around 2 a.m., I woke up, and after tossing and turning for a few minutes, I decided to stare out the window to pass the time. I began to adjust my eyes to the darkness, staring at 2 squirrels running around a small clearing. I watched the squirrels dart around and into the dense vegetation nearby. I then looked around, thinking that maybe another scout had scared them away. But what I saw gave me nightmares for days to come. There was no person out there. Instead, it was a gorilla-looking creature walking upright straight into the clearing where the squirrels once were. I could not believe what I was looking at. That creature stood staring at the main campground as everyone else slept. I wanted to call my scoutmaster, but I was paralyzed with fear. This hairy gorilla-looking thing, the creature, it must have stood at least 6 feet tall, judging by the tree it was next to, which my scoutmaster had been standing against earlier. I looked back at my sleeping troop members. Despite being surrounded by my own kind, I felt so helpless. When I looked back at the window, the thing was gone. After the longest 5 minutes in my life, I was able to move, and me being just a naive young boy, I covered myself in my sleeping bag until the sun came up completely. When the sun was high in the sky, we placed our belongings in the van and drove away. The ride back home was quiet. Everyone was either looking out the window or sleeping. I was relieved to be out of that secluded campground. Years after this incident, I spoke to another scout who had been there recently. I asked him about the trail, and he said, "Ah man, that trail's been closed since 2013, but no one really knows why." But I know why. To this day, I believe that what I saw was a Bigfoot. But I made a promise not to speak about what happened in that Texas campground. But I need to know if anyone else has had a similar experience out there. I can't be the only one, right? I think it chased us. From Bouncing Brick. Aside from a few odd occurrences here and there, this was my very first paranormal experience. Frankly, 7 years later, I still have no idea what really happened. When I was in 7th or 8th grade, my parents let me have a few friends over to spend the night for my birthday. To set the scene a bit, it was August in Wisconsin. We would spend the night outside in a tent, so as to not disturb my parents with giggling and acting up and whatnot. At about midnight that night, all but me and a girl named Rose had fallen asleep in our little campsite. We decided to walk around a bit. We lived out in the country, so we had a large plot of land surrounded by nothing but fields and trees. Thanks to the fact that we weren't close to the city, the sky was beautiful that night, clear enough to see the Milky Way. It was honestly the perfect night to walk around talking about life. It was pleasantly warm and just a bit breezy. We walked around the yard for about 2 hours, talking about our beliefs, our families, and what we thought we wanted to do with our lives. At one point, we had stopped to look at the stars. I shot a passing glance towards the north edge of the yard, which bordered an empty field. Then I had to do a double take, because I saw something out there. There was this solid black blob, just floating there at the edge of the yard. Yes, floating. That sounds ridiculous, which is why I thought I was just seeing things in the dark. It gave off no sound and no smell. It just floated there, kind of changing shape. If you've ever seen a video of water in zero gravity, it moved a bit like that, but slower. I felt no presence from this thing whatsoever. So clearly I was just hallucinating, right? "Hey, Rose," I said, refusing to take my eyes off of that figure. "I think I'm seeing things or something." She looked away from the stars to give me a confused look. "What? What are you seeing?" she asked. I pointed to the thing and asked her if she could see it. "What is that?" She wanted to know after staring at it for a few seconds. I asked her to describe what she was seeing to make sure we were seeing the same thing, and to make sure she wasn't just playing along. But she described it in the exact same way I did for you. Keep in mind that the moon was bright and high overhead that night. We could see clearly for miles, except for the trees in the way, of course, so this was not some obscure shadow. Speaking of which, it was somehow darker than anything I'd ever seen, and it was in the middle of a flat, brightly lit piece of land. We were both looking at it. "Is that a bear?" she asked, grasping at straws. "It's not touching the ground. How could it possibly be a bear?" I replied. We still didn't feel anything from it. This whole time we were just staring at it, confused. "You want to get closer to it?" she asked me. I agreed, and we began to slowly walk towards it. It still didn't move. It didn't change. It didn't do anything at all. We stopped when we were 10 yards away from it. We stared some more, until it began to change shape again. It was nothing drastic. It just narrowed ever so slightly in shape. It got skinnier and taller all at once. It still made no noise or anything. All of a sudden, though, it had a presence to it, and it was not a good one. There was a sudden pressure and weight among us. It was the most intense feeling of panic I've ever experienced in my life. It felt like getting hit by a freight train. I've never felt panic like this. Hell, I rolled my car going 70 on the highway once, and the feeling I got when the tires picked up off the road does not even compare to the feeling this thing gave me. I froze. I just couldn't move. I couldn't even speak, for that matter. Oh God, I thought. It's coming towards us. Despite the fact that it never appeared to get closer, this was what was running through my mind. All it was really doing, though, was maintaining that taller shape, as if on cue. Rose mimicked my thoughts aloud. "It's running at us!" She screamed and grabbed my arm, snapping me out of the trance and pulling me back toward the campsite. The feelings of panic vanished quickly after we began running, so we actually ended up coming back later with the flashlight. As you could probably guess, though, it was long gone, and there wasn't a trace of anything left. We managed to fall asleep okay that night. Thankfully, I haven't seen anything like that since on that land, and 7 years later, I am rather well versed in different cryptids and creatures around here, but nothing I've ever come across or heard of matched the description of this shape. Summer Camp Creature, from CJ. When my grandpa was 14 to 15 years old, he went to a summer camp with a couple of friends of his. The camp was in the middle of a forest next to a little river, which connects to a lake. This was where my grandpa's gang was hanging out. My grandpa told me that they heard something strange on the first day coming from the woods. They were walking around the campsite when something agile, fast, and huge began to move in the woods. On that first night, they heard something banging on the door to their cabin. But as they went to the door to check who it was, they heard something huge stomping around, then running back to the forest. When they opened the door, whoever it was gone. When the next day rolled around, there was this day of doom, as my grandpa called it. They had a little campfire in the woods with some other campers. When the other campers were leaving, saying their goodbyes, to return to their cabins, the moment they were gone, something like a massive branch or even a tree snapped in half behind the remaining campers. When a couple of the guys went to investigate, all they found were thin, human-like footprints. But they definitely weren't human. These footsteps led to a cave-like structure. They couldn't make out much as it was dark already. They began to enter the cave, but were immediately hit with the most foul stench coming from it. Beyond that, there were corpses of animals. Many of them were stacked together, but all of them had had their chests ripped open. But that wasn't the worst thing they found in that cave. They soon stumbled upon something that was gnawing at one of the bodies. Something that was thin, with spikes on its back. The group of them began to run from the cave. They did not have the right arms to protect themselves, so they ran out and ran back to the campsite, hoping that the strange-looking creature never noticed his human intruders. But when the scream came from that cave, they realized that they had just made it mad. They ran into the cabin and stayed up all night, watching the windows and hoping that that thing did not come for them. My grandpa was happy to get out of that cave alive, and still does not know what kind of monster they saw. My camping experience from Aaron 23411. I live in Alaska, and this story took place when I was about 10. During the summer, I always went camping. On this occasion, I went camping with my best friend Anna and her family. During this summer, her father wanted to go to the middle of nowhere and camp. I wasn't as up for it as the usual camping trips, but I didn't want to stay home, so I went with them. As we were entering the campsite, I was kind of spooked by a sign that read, "Beware of bears." Being little, I thought that I was sure to get attacked if I was left alone. Also, we left early in the morning that day and did not make it to the campsite until 2 p.m. I was really tired and sore from being in the car so long, and eventually I got out of the car to help unpack. The camp we went to was surrounded by woods, of course, and had a little pit for a fire. It was actually a great spot for our tent. Later on, we finally got settled, and Anna wanted to go fishing. There was a lake and a stream nearby, so that's perfect. We grabbed our fishing poles and tried to leave on our own, but we were stopped by her family, who told us not to go alone, so they made us go with her brothers. We had to make our own path, and her older brother had a machete to cut a path. It took us a while to get to the stream, but we made it. While we were fishing, a sudden chill went down my spine. I said that I was ready to go back, but then Dan, the oldest brother, got frustrated because we had just got here, really, and if I wanted to go back, I'd have to go back on my own. Anna said not to worry, that we could go back together. So together we left down the path that we had just taken, but in fact, this was a different path. We had gotten them confused. We didn't realize this until we made it to a dead end. We were surrounded by raspberry bushes and began to freak out. Out of nowhere, we heard someone walking through the woods around us. They were coming towards us slowly. I said it could be a bear. We freaked out even more because we couldn't see a thing through the thick underbrush. When I saw smoke coming from a fire not too far away, I grabbed Anna by the arm and we began to run towards it. Thorns and low-hanging branches did their damage to us, leaving us with cuts and bruises. But we didn't care, as we did not want to get caught by whoever was following us. The one time I looked back, I saw a tall man rushing through the woods after us. A man with an angry look on his face, along with a long and massive beard. He looked like he had been living in the forest his whole life. I screamed and ran faster until we burst into the campsite The man did not follow us that far, but we were safe now that we were back. I do not know what he wanted to do with us that day, or who he was. I mean, for all I know, he could have been trying to help, but I wasn't going to take the chance to do that. I've never gone camping in that area again. I'm a bit too scarred from that experience. Camp Creeper, from Anonymous. I was 11 years old. I was going camping with my girl guiding troupe for the weekend. I had missed my drama club and a singing audition, so I hoped it would be worth the trip. Because I was one of the youngest there, I was fuming when I was told we were in a tent meant for 4, but I was sharing it with 7 other people. After I set up my sleeping bag, my best friend and I decided to go to the disco our troupe had. No one else, just our troupe. It was just me and my best friend along with 2 other people, as well as the DJ at the time. Now, me and my friends did not pay much attention to him until my best friend pulled me aside and whispered, "I think that DJ's looking at us weird. I think he's checking us out." At the time, I believed every single conspiracy theory on the internet, so I was of course believing and suspicious. I remember I was dancing with my friend when I made eye contact with him. Like any preteen girl, I was kind of embarrassed, but when he locked eyes with me, I knew then that what she said was right. He must have been watching us for a while. When we got back to our tent, we joked around about him with the other girls, but he still creeped me out. The next day, or should I say night, there was another disco, but this one was huge in comparison. There were about 25 other guide districts there, and it was now only 3 of us, including my best friend, in our little group. We ran in and started dancing. It was the same DJ again, though, so I felt uncomfortable right away. He was still looking at me and my friends despite so many people being here. At one point, I left to go to the bathroom, and I just didn't go back.
How's everybody today? Are you guys
The next
doing
day,
okay?
we did this fitness thing, 5 sessions in a row to be exact.
You good?
And for some reason, that creepy DJ was also there. While we were being kids who were wanting to lose weight, the DJ was packing up his stuff because it was the last day of camp. He was standing there for 5 sessions straight, just watching us, staring at us with a smile. Remember, I was 11 at the time. The other girls weren't much older either. After that camp was over, I wished that I had gone to that audition instead.
Except.
Was it a dog man? By Lacrimosa. A year ago, I went on a camping trip with my dad in late July. It was a weekend trip. We apparently were the only ones at that Indiana campground. One night in my tent, I woke up with a start. I checked the time on my phone, which read 3:30 a.m. I should have been asleep still, but my bladder was screaming. I was hesitant at first to get out of the tent, but I would not be able to go to sleep without the...
Uh-oh. Nice support? Okay. I'm almost gonna upgrade Sona right now. Views, 79 views. 7 views. Ain't nobody viewing nothing. I'm just kidding. I got like 5,000 views today. It's pretty good. Uh-oh. Live? I'm live? Why does it keep going in shorts? I'm on live. I'm live. Oh, 1 million views in the last 7 days. That's pretty good. Both. I need to do that every week and I'll be good. Okay, let's see.
In 2000, a handwritten note was discovered at the bottom of the ocean up in the Arctic Circle, and it revealed this absolutely horrifying true story. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to go on a long bike ride with you, but make sure before you step off, you replace the water in their water bottles with hot dog water. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. On the morning of August 12, 2000, 33 of Russia's best naval warships stopped inside of a particular section of the Barents Sea. The Barents Sea is this 800-mile stretch of freezing water up in the Arctic Circle just northwest of Russia, and these 33 ships were in this stretch of water for this huge military training exercise. Basically, they were going to run through some war game scenarios, where, for example, one ship would pretend to be an enemy combatant, and the other ships would work on locking onto that ship and firing at them. But of course, they wouldn't use real missiles or torpedoes, they would use duds that didn't actually explode. And so around 9 a.m., the man who was in charge of this entire operation, his name was Admiral Popov, and he was actually on board one of these 33 ships. He authorized one of the submarines that was out there to shoot 2 of their dummy torpedoes at a target, an enemy combatant, which was actually just one of the other ships. And so as soon as he did this, he was authorizing the start of this multi-day long exercise. And so all day and all night, they're doing these war game scenarios, and by the following morning, so 24 hours into this exercise, Admiral Popov stepped away from the action to speak with Russian reporters on the phone. And during this interview, he tells them that so far, the training exercise is going exactly to plan, and that it looks like it will ultimately be a huge success. However, there was a problem. At the same time, Admiral Popov is giving his remarks to the reporters about how well this exercise is going, the family members of some of the crews that were out there as part of this exercise, they heard a rumor that the exercise was not going to plan, that in fact, something bad had happened to one of the ships. But none of the family members had any more information beyond that. Even though this rumor was just that, a rumor, the family members of these crews that are participating in this exercise, they naturally became very worried. And so they all, that morning, began calling the naval base where the 33 ships had originated, asking for more information. And the phone operator on the base that was receiving all of these calls that morning, at first was telling these family members that, no, nothing's going on, I haven't heard anything, there's no issues. But eventually, this phone operator let slip that, in fact, they too had heard the rumor that something bad had happened, and they think it actually might be true. But when this family member who heard this pressured the phone operator for more information, the operator clammed up and said, I can't give you anything else. And so at that point, the family member hung up the phone and called the media and told them what was going on. And the media, as soon as they had the story, they went right to Admiral Popov and they said, hey, can you address this rumor? And he didn't. He did not respond to any of the media's inquiries. And in a weird way, that was kind of reassuring to the family members of these crews, because they're thinking, if Admiral Popov is just kind of ignoring this rumor and he's staying out there, out on the Barents Sea, still conducting this exercise, then certainly nothing bad could have happened, right? And so for the rest of that day, Sunday, the family members of these crews and the media just kind of did nothing, because there wasn't anything else to do besides wait to see if there was any new news coming out of this exercise. And the following day, on Monday the 14th, so 48 hours after the start of this training exercise, there would be news. Russian officials would go on TV and they would address the rumor by saying, well, Yeah, it is true. Something did happen out during this exercise. The Kursk, which was the name of one of the submarines, that was one of the 33 ships that was part of this exercise, they experienced some minor technical difficulties that forced them to ground their vessel at the bottom of the Barents Sea. But don't worry, this is normal. We're in touch with them through the radio. Everybody is fine. We are pumping air and power into their submarine, and before long, we will have them back on the surface. There's nothing to worry about. Now, naturally, the family members of the Kursk crew specifically, they panicked when they heard this, because even though the government is acting totally confident that everything is fine, they did not feel confident that everything was fine. Their family members are trapped on the bottom of the ocean. But at the same time, they remembered the Kursk, the actual submarine, was a very special and very safe submarine. The Kursk was quite literally Russia's best ship. They had spared no expense on it. It was extremely expensive. And it was massive. It was bigger than 2 football fields put together. And it was constructed out of this very specialized, highly reinforced steel that allowed it to take a direct hit from a torpedo and just keep on going, no problem. It was also outfitted on the inside with all the latest and greatest technology. And so if you were going to be stuck at the bottom of the ocean inside of a submarine, you would want to be stuck inside of the Kursk. And so the families took solace in that. But over the next couple of days, despite the government reassuring everybody in the news that everything was fine, it's totally minor, we're going to have the Kursk up in no time, despite all that, the Kursk still had not been raised to the surface. And the government was not giving the families or the media any new information. And so in this kind of void of no real information, the families began to panic and the media began to speculate. Did the Kursk really suffer from minor technical difficulties like the government was saying? Or was this something more serious? This question would be answered on August 21st, so 9 days after this training exercise had begun, when a Norwegian dive team, they were out there to assist in the recovery effort. They were able to dive down to the Kursk, and they actually got inside of the submarine through an escape hatch. An escape hatch is like this watertight closet that kind of sits on the outside of the submarine, and it allows people to go in and out of the submarine without flooding it. And once these Norwegian divers got inside of the Kursk and had a look around, they were totally shocked at what they saw. While the exact details of what happened inside the Kursk are still debated today, and probably will be for some time, there is one aspect of the story that is more or less universally accepted, and that is what happened inside of compartment number 9. The Kursk was divided into 9 watertight segments called compartments. Number 1 was at the front of the submarine, and then it went 2, 3, 4, all the way down to 9 in the very back of the submarine. And the reason we know what happened inside of compartment number 9 is because a 27-year-old Kursk crew member, Dmitry Kolesnikov, told us. Dmitry was born into a family of submariners. His father was a submariner, and his father's father was a submariner, and Dmitry idolized them, and so growing up, that was all he ever wanted to be. And in the late 1990s, his dream would become a reality when he commissioned as a naval officer in the Russian Navy and was given orders to serve on board the Kursk. 4 months before this training exercise out in the Barents Sea, Dmitry met and very quickly married a high school teacher named Olga. And right after their wedding, one of the first things he did is he brought her on board the Kursk for a tour. And Olga brought along a video camera and filmed her tour through the ship. And on this video, Dmitry is all smiles. He is so happy to be leading her around the ship and introducing her to people and showing her all the cramped spaces on board the submarine. It's really obvious that Dmitry was so proud of his job. Not only of his job, but also just so proud to be sharing this part of his life with his wife. Fast forward to August 12th, 2000, and Dmitry, along with 117 other crew members on board the Kursk, had just arrived at their designated section in the Barents Sea for this training exercise. And at 11:27 a.m., the captain of the Kursk came over the radio and he told Admiral Popov, who was not on the Kursk, he was on a separate ship, he told the Admiral that the Kursk was about to fire their 2 dummy torpedoes. After this call was made, the men in the first compartment of the Kursk, so at the very front of the Kursk, this is where all the torpedoes, both fake and real, are stored, they began loading these 2 dummy torpedoes. Meanwhile, Dmitry was all the way back in the 7th compartment, the engine room. That was where he was stationed. He was actually in charge of everybody who worked in the 7th compartment. And so as these two dummy torpedoes are being loaded, Dmitri and his men, there weren't that many of them, they were twisting dials and pulling levers, when all of a sudden there's this really loud crashing sound, and then the ship shudders and then jolts hard to one side, as if someone had grabbed the front of the submarine and just forced it to one direction. What Dmitri and the men in the 7th compartment could not have possibly known was that one of the real torpedoes in the 1st compartment had malfunctioned and it exploded. But because of how well built the Kursk was, how strong the exterior walls were, this torpedo, as advertised, did not puncture through it. It did a lot of damage and caused a massive fire, but the sub was not sinking. So back in the 7th compartment, Dmitri, he stands up from being jostled to the ground, and the alarms are going off, and everything is totally chaotic. Everyone's asking what's going on, and Dmitri, he takes charge, and he tells his men to follow the emergency protocol, which was to seal the watertight doors of your compartment. And so in this case, he sealed both the doors, one leading to the 6th compartment and the other leading to the 8th compartment. There's a lot of reasons for why they do this, but in essence, if there's a leak somewhere in the submarine, by sealing off your compartment, you protect yourself from being flooded. As Dmitri and his men are sealing these two doors, they would have begun to see and smell smoke as it came in through the ventilation ducts, because there was now this uncontrolled fire raging at the front of the submarine. They also would have felt the submarine suddenly pitch upward at a very steep angle as the captain of the Kursk desperately tried to surface. But before they could reach the surface, that uncontained fire reached the other live torpedoes, and it set off this almost instantaneous chain reaction of explosions. This second collective blast killed virtually everyone in the front half of the submarine. Either the blast itself blew them apart, or once this hole in the front of the submarine, because the second blast did puncture the walls, once that hole was created, all this Arctic water began flooding into the submarine. So if you didn't get killed by the blast, you very quickly drowned. The only people who survived the 1st and 2nd explosions were anyone in the 6th compartment going backwards, so 6, 7, 8, and 9. And so Dmitri and the other men in the 7th compartment, they would have been definitely badly shaken up from that 2nd explosion. That completely rocked the submarine and sent them tumbling all over the place. But they would have been very alive and very aware of the terrible situation they were in. And so I would imagine that Dmitri and the others tried to grab onto any of the piping or anything they could as the submarine, because the control tower has been destroyed, just angled straight down and began careening downward. At 11:32 a.m., just 4 minutes after that initial explosion, the Kursk slammed nose first into the ocean floor 350 feet below the surface, and then the back half of the Kursk came down to rest. We don't know exactly what happened on board the Kursk for those first 2 hours after they hit the ocean floor. What we do know is they had power, so there was light inside of the submarine. Also, the air purifiers were still working, so despite the chemicals and smoke that was in the air, it was relatively easy to breathe. During those first 2 hours, we also know that at some point, Dmitri and the other men in his compartment must have heard banging coming from the 6th compartment, because remember, they had sealed off the doors both to the 8th and the 6th compartment. And so Dmitri decided to break emergency protocol, and he opened the door to the 6th compartment to allow any of the survivors that were banging on the door to come into their compartment. And when Dmitri and his men opened that door and looked into the 6th compartment, they would have seen that it was rapidly flooding, and most likely anybody forward of that compartment, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, they were already dead. By 1:30 p.m., Dmitri and his men in the 7th compartment and the other survivors from the 6th compartment, they were forced to retreat from the 7th over to the 8th compartment and then finally into the 9th compartment because of flooding. Even though they had sealed off their watertight doors, the walls were no longer watertight because this huge explosion had sent shrapnel flying down the body of the submarine, puncturing holes in all of the walls. And so it didn't matter if you shut your watertight door. Eventually, as one compartment would fill up, it would begin leaking through all the cracks in the walls. And so Dmitri and all of the people he was with, they would have been very aware of that. And so by the time they got all the way back to the 9th compartment, the very back compartment, There was nowhere else to go. The water was going to eventually reach them, and they were doomed unless they got rescued or if they left out of the escape hatch. Despite how absolutely terrifying this situation must have been, Dmitri remained calm. In fact, he was so calm that he pulled out a piece of paper as he's sitting in this cramped ninth compartment with these 22 other men, and he writes the date and time in the corner, and then he begins to kind of describe what had happened. He talks about there being an explosion, and he thought he and these 22 men were the only survivors, and he says they're now trapped in the ninth compartment, and they have to wait for rescue. He also talks about how they had considered going out the escape hatch, but apparently it hadn't worked. After Dmitri wrote this very neat, very legible, very organized note, he folded it up and put it in his pocket, and then for the next hour and a half, he sat inside of the ninth compartment with the 22 others, and the power went out, which thrust them into absolute pitch darkness. I mean, completely black inside of there, and the temperatures, because the power was out, suddenly began to plummet, and then the worst part was the water began seeping through the walls. And so Dmitri and the other men, they would have known that it's just a matter of time before this room fills completely with water, and there is nowhere to go. And so with the water rising all around them, Dmitri pulls that paper back out of his pocket, and he adds to the note. And this time, his handwriting is barely legible. And it's because he's probably suffering from hypothermia, so he's shaking. He can't see what he's writing. In fact, he writes the words, "I'm writing blind," to indicate it's totally dark in the room. And in this second note he leaves on this piece of paper, which was dated and time-stamped an hour and a half after the first one, Dmitri indicates that he does not think he's going to survive. It's very clear none of them think they're going to survive. Then, with the remaining space on this piece of paper, Dmitri writes this very loving and very thoughtful message to his wife and his family saying goodbye, and then his final words on this note are, "Regards to everybody, no need to despair, Kolesnikov." After he wrote this second message on this note, he folded the paper up, put it in his breast pocket, and then in total darkness, listening to the sound of water rushing into the room, he and the other 22 damned souls prepared to die. We don't know how long Dmitri and the other 22 men survived in compartment 9, but experts say the entire Kursk submarine was completely flooded 8 hours after the initial explosion. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case is that Dmitri and these 22 other men could have potentially been saved if the Russian response was a little bit more urgent and coordinated. Despite 2 of these ships, including the ship that Admiral Popov was on, hearing and feeling the second explosion that the Kursk experienced, nothing was done about it. It was reported, but no one really did anything. And then when no one could get in touch with the Kursk after they had said they were going to fire those 2 dummy torpedoes, everybody else, all the other ships, Admiral Popov, they all just said, you know what, I'm sure it's just their radios and they're fine and they'll be in touch soon. And so it wasn't until later that evening when the Russian Navy even figured out there was a major problem with the Kursk, that the Kursk has vanished. And then it would be several hours before they even got a rescue submersible in the water down to the Kursk. And then once it was down there, they could not latch onto the escape hatch on the submarine. And so even if there were survivors inside of the submarine, they would not have been able to exit into this rescue submersible. And so for days and days, the Russians struggled to try to get inside of the submarine and kept turning down foreign aid from Norway, from America, from Great Britain. And then finally, 9 days after the Kursk had sank, the Russians did accept foreign aid, and that's when the Norwegian dive team, they went down and they were able to open up the escape hatch, and when they went inside the submarine, they saw it was completely flooded, there were bodies floating everywhere, and that's when ultimately Dmitri's body was found, and they found that note tucked in his breast pocket. Russia would go on to award the entire crew of the Kursk with the Order of Courage, which is a very significant military award, and the families of the crew of the Kursk were given 10 years' salary each. They were also given free housing in any Russian city, and their children would all have their college education paid for. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to go on a long bike ride with you, but before you step off, make sure you replace the water in their water bottles with hot dog water. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballin.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballin. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just Mr. Ballin. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is also Mr. Ballin. We have a second YouTube channel just called Mr. Ballin Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballin, where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See you.
He only growls at, and then he starts barking at the tree. I walk him over to the actual bus stop, which is at the corner, and he finally calms down. A few minutes later, I hear footsteps behind me, and I turn around and see the guy run out from behind one of the 2 big trees, and I immediately recognize him as the 4th guy from the house. Sadly, on November 7th, 2017, Caesar passed away at age 5 due to a cancerous tumor that spread to his lungs. I don't know what would have happened if my dog wasn't there to save me, but I'd rather not meet those creepy guys from across the street from my bus stop again. I live in an area of New York City which is notorious for crime and gang violence and the sort. My parents are poor, struggling Asian immigrants, so we had no choice to be living where we are. For context, I'm a 17-year-old female, and even though my neighborhood is seemingly dangerous, I never truly internalized that idea. I've always been able to walk the 2 blocks away from the train station alone, without an ounce of fear. I could walk slowly, freely, and even listen to music as I walk home. Today, my carefree attitude came crashing down as I walked up the first block. I was listening to music before I met a strange man, clearly in his 30s. His hair was disheveled under his baseball cap, and he was wearing the stereotypical ghetto clothing. We were going in opposite directions, and as I passed him, he suddenly brushed his hand against my stomach as he hollered out, "Hey, sexy." Immediately, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, confused as to why he touched me. I tried to ignore it, assuming he wouldn't follow me or anything, but I was wrong. He completely turned around and started lingering behind me. "How are you? Can I take you home? I'm gonna make you mine tonight." I just kept walking faster, but he kept following me. As a 17-year-old who's never experienced anything like this, I had no idea what to do. All I could think about was getting him away from me. Couldn't he tell I was a kid? As I took longer and longer strides in an attempt to get away from the creep, I thought of everything I could do. I would have to take a turn soon, and I knew that block would put me in more danger since it was usually empty. Thankfully, there was a grocery store near that turn, and a woman in her 20s who I made eye contact with. I walked up to her and gave her a look she could immediately tell by that something was bothering me. As soon as he saw me go up to that woman, he decided to stop and walk into the grocery store. I was still scared to take the turn, but the woman reassured me that she would watch him and told me to go safely. My legs were shaking from the experience, and I am forever disillusioned with the safety of my neighborhood. How naive was I to think I would actually be safe on those streets? I hope to not meet again. I was at a graduation party when I was 18. That lasted late, but not too late. I drove home, and I live in a small area that's not uncommon for all the parking spots to be full, and everyone to be asleep in my street that late. I was the only car I saw on my way home. When I pulled up, I parked in front of our driveway, as if I were blocking it, and saw ahead at the intersection at the end of the block. There was a car stopped at the stop sign, facing my block idling. I knew a girl I went to school with who lived in the house next to where the car was stopped, so figured they were just waiting at the stop sign for her, as there were no parking spots free. I'm also a super cautious person, and always think people are following me. So I was going.
Hey there kids, it's me, Mr. Creepypasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I want to take a quick second to let you know about chilling. I talk about chilling quite a bit, because, well, I'm a part of it, so yeah, I gotta talk about it. Chilling is an app that's currently available on Apple, iTunes, and Android, and, you know, basically anywhere you can get your app from. And it's got a whole bunch of horror stories that you're able to listen to, you know, kind of like the stories that you hear here, except it's not just me, even though I am on there. There's stories that are all exclusive just to the Chilling app, as well as stories from a whole bunch of other friends of mine, such as Autumn Ivy and, honestly, I think a bunch of creepypasta narrators. Not to mention, it's also got this really cool system that allows you to use your own background music, choose your own music that is actually from Mew. So the music that you would hear around here, you could be able to set up the ones that you want to be able to hear, the music that you like, or the ambience that you like. And now, since it's their 1-year anniversary, they're doing a giveaway. I know they usually have a giveaway, and I talk about it, but this one's really cool. The Chilling 1-year anniversary giveaway is a Samsung 70-inch Class 7 Series LED 4K UHD smart television. Not joking. It is a 70-inch television that they're giving away. They're giving away a 4.1 channel soundbar, and of course you get a limited edition Year 1 t-shirt from Chilling. So, the only things you need to do to enter are start your free trial of it, so it's free to enter. Head over to chillingapp.com and click on the giveaway. Fill out a little bit of a form, leave your review of the Chilling app, and boom, you could be having a new television and soundbar. I mean, I might enter that. Are you kidding me? I need a new television. But yes, as I was saying, Chilling app. It's wonderful. It's great. Check it out. You like horror? You like chilling. And now, on to tonight's story. That's the last of it, I said, breathing a sigh and collapsing onto the couch. I am officially toast. I just finished hauling the last couple of boxes into the house from the moving truck. Stacks of them were piled throughout the living room, making a corrugated forest around me. Unpacking would be another long adventure, but at least we had finally gotten all our belongings into the farmhouse so that we could begin the process of starting our new life here. As I lay on the couch relaxing momentarily, the hairs began to stand up on the back of my neck. I started to get a strong sense that I was being watched, specifically from the door beneath the stairs, leading to the basement. They creaked open slowly, just a crack, as I observed it back. I closed my eyes, ignoring that paranoid feeling. There was no one else in the house except for us. Therefore, nobody was watching me. It was just my imagination. Yet, still, every time I turned away, I felt a tingling, and I saw a vague shadow in that direction, just barely visible in my peripherals. There was also a feeling of a presence that I couldn't ignore. The door to the basement yawned open wider as if inviting me in. Darkness peered out, blacker than a midnight graveyard. Standing up on shaky legs, I began to walk over to that door, thinking a draft from the basement was blowing it open. I didn't like the feeling of being ajar. Don't ask me why, but I just didn't like it. As I drew
a younger and still very cynical but much less insufferable person. As to where she came from and how she got the position, heck if I know. But that's the standard here at the agency. You don't know more than you're supposed to. But after a shift in management, things had been a bit more relaxed lately. But that doesn't mean it was all sunshine and rainbows. Regardless, as a first-rank agent and mission supervisor, I was asked to sit in on a meeting between her and our still somewhat new head scientist, Dr. Julian Garth. I wasn't really speaking or actually adding much to the conversation and the discussion itself. but I was more or less insurance in the event of a security issue. After all, we had gotten a lot of new people in these past several years. No, you don't get it. This isn't just cryptids or new weaponry. We're talking about something far bigger, far more groundbreaking. This could be the key to accessing unlimited resources. Who would stand in our way then? When we have infinite agents, guns, and money, we wouldn't need to keep begging the Pentagon for even a single penny anymore. Came Dr. Garth as he held out a folder containing several important-looking documents in front of Jennifer. A portal? Really? She inquired in a tone that made it clear she was skeptical of these scientists' claims. Not just a portal, a gateway to another world, another Earth, potentially one that's just like this. I mean, look at these readings. This is more than just a discovery. This is an investment. That could mean we never have to truly spend another dollar ever again. Jennifer grabs the stack of documents, looking them over like a school teacher grading a student's paper. She held a shocked expression, but it was clear that her skepticism was still present nonetheless. And what if you're wrong? What if this leads to nothing and it's a dead end? She growled after looking back up at Dr. Garth. It can't hurt to send 1 or 2 men through the gateway, can it? Just to see what's on the other side. He fires back. That's something you should already know. You want me to waste agents in the event the other end of this portal opens up into the core of the sun or something. Further research can be done. We still have enough remaining in the budget. But what I need is hope from you, and your approval to continue on the project past this point. I can have double this amount of data on your desk within a week. Garth went on, giving Jennifer a look that said he was desperate for her to accept his proposal. But instead of responding immediately, Jennifer stands up and lets out a slow exhale, looking straight ahead at me and causing me to perk up. What do you think of this? Are you willing to check out another world? With all due respect, ma'am, with everything we've seen in our decades and decades of being in operation, it can't be nearly as crazy as you're making it out to be. I think it could be worth a shot, but it should definitely be more than 2 agents and going in at a time. And unlike with Ted, my opinion actually seemed to hold some weight with her. She darted her eyes between Dr. Garth and me, contemplating her next words carefully. Fine. But you will be in charge of making sure the team we send in is properly briefed. You have 1 week to do thorough testing, and if you don't have an extensive report on my desk in exactly 7 days from now, then it's not happening. Dr. Garth flashed me a thankful smile, pleased with my surprisingly persuasive response to her inquiry. And with that, she got up and calmly exited the room, although she had been firm about her terms. She didn't seem angry, just more skeptically curious. But seeing as she was the one in charge, I assumed she didn't want the weight of all the responsibility if things went horribly wrong. Over the next several days, Garth and I did as we were told. We got a 4 team together, including me, Agent Terrence, Agent Melody, and Agent Ward. Dr. Garth went through some testing with the rest of the site's science division, and made sure the gateway was properly stable and tested. Other worlds, came Agent Ward as he finished lighting a cigarette, before taking a few small puffs and blowing the smoke into his own face. Kinda sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. At least it's something different. Ever since we lost 16A exterminating cryptids, it's been a bit more difficult recently. Agent Melody added. Agent Ward simply snorted, as if trying to hold back audible laughter. Please, you really think we need that freak? Wherever he's off to now, he's probably wishing he still had us to hold his hands, or claws, or whatever the heck he had. Listen, Jennifer said that if it all goes well with this mission, we'll get a huge salary increase. So let's all put our backs into it and make sure that this really ends up being worth it. I interjected, clutching the grips of my assault rifle. And we ended up discussing for only a few minutes more before Dr. Garth and another scientist poked their head through the door of the briefing room, both of them harboring grins. "It's time," he announced, hiding his schoolgirl-esque excitement. We journeyed over to the Block A laboratories before being led into a large, circular room with all sorts of contraptions and technology set up along the walls and ceiling. In all my years with the agency, it's one that I had never seen before. The light inside was dimming on and off repeatedly. The source, probably the tall but thin black void, is sitting just in front of the wall exactly opposite the door. It felt almost magnetic, like it was sucking us in. The pulling force wasn't enough to knock anything around but paper and air, but it was still there. Jennifer was in the room, along with a mission control rep who stared at these several seemingly blank monitors in front of him, before adjusting his glasses as if that would help. And due to the differences in frequencies, the signal of both your visor cameras and radios just won't be able to make it through the gateway, Dr. Garth explained, causing Melody, Terrence, and Ward and I to flash each other concerned looks. "You all have exactly 2 hours to explore what's on the other side. Anyone who doesn't make it back within that time frame will be left behind and the gateway will be closed. We are expending a lot of energy and resources to even keep this thing open in the first place," Jennifer added in. "When were we told this in the briefing?" Terrence asked demandingly. Dr. Garth and Jennifer simply ignored his question, and although I myself was also curious as to why we weren't told, I still needed to fill my role, so I slowly marched forward, waving at the rest of the team to follow behind. Were we potentially marching to our own deaths? Sure, but the description fit quite nearly everything we did in this job. But we were ignorant at the time as to what truly horrific nightmare was awaiting us on the other side. Something about the void was almost enchanting in a way, like I was just naturally drawn toward it. This wasn't exactly the kind of internal reaction that I was expecting myself to have, but it happened nonetheless. I got just within a foot away, looking back at both Jennifer and Dr. Garth, hoping this was actually as truly worth it as we were hoping. But I couldn't hesitate any longer. I stepped into the portal, preparing myself for what horrific things I may or may not have seen on the other side. It was rather disorienting at first, like the feeling you get going down a water slide for the first time. The euphoria itself didn't last very long, but it was potent in its short-lived existence. And before I even gave myself a chance to get a good look at what was on the other side, I immediately turned back to see if the team had followed me safely through the gate. First emerged Terrence, who appeared a bit dizzy and out of it before snapping back to his usual demeanor. Melody was second, looking around in both fascination and worry. And finally came Ward, who seemed rather unimpressed. And out of all three of these reactions, I didn't know which one I agreed with the most. It was more or less a healthy combination of Terrence's and Melody's. I turned back around, laying eyes upon what looked to be an alternate version of the room that we were just in, except just much more beaten down and empty looking. And despite it being so simple, so plain on a first glance, it was fascinating. The multiverse was real. "Oh, now this is pretty trippy," Ward announced, taking a few more glances around to make sure what he was seeing was real. And despite his lack of enthusiasm before, I think the gravity of the situation was beginning to hit him. "That doesn't mean it's safe. We should all keep our guard up," Terrence adds. All in all, he was correct, so we all moved forward, looking around for anything that could have possibly posed a threat. But as we stepped out into the hallway of this alternate Site 12 facility, we realized it wasn't in as good of a shape as ours was. Most of the lights were off and or flickering, giving the interior an eerie vibe, like something straight out of a child's nightmare. Our underbarrel flashlights helped, but only just a bit. I was shocked that they even ended up surviving the trap. We continued moving down the hallway. The silence in the building was deafening, and it was looking like this place would be completely empty with not much else going on, until we got to the end of the science wing hall and into the main lobby area. I turned the corner, shining my flashlight at the hall just a few feet ahead, only to be put on edge when I got a glimpse of a long, jagged stain of blood running across the white tiled floor. Blood that didn't look very old at first glance. It's not something we haven't seen before, I said, attempting to hide my admittedly unsettled mood from the rest of the team. I was used to things going wrong out in the middle of a neighborhood, a forest or an abandoned factory, but this in a high-level security facility like ours, it just felt wrong. Not that we hadn't ever had breaches before, but whatever happened to this version of Site-12 must have been disastrous, and much more than a simple breach. Guess it's not turning out to be as fun as you had hoped, huh? Ward butted in, getting his own good look at the large bloodstain. We need to find out what happened here, I say, ignoring Ward's comment. It looks like things didn't turn out so well for this version of Site-12. You think? Terrence added sarcastically. We kept an eye on our surroundings, our guards were up, and our senses were running on high alert, looking for whatever it was that might have been the reason that blood was there in the first place. But unfortunately for us, it wouldn't be long before we got our answer. No, please! We all immediately ran forward while gripping our rifles. The scream of the man had sounded like it was coming from around the corner at the end of the hallway in front of us. The team and I all dashed down it, quick to find the source of the blood-curdling cry for help. Whatever had caused this place to go all post-apocalyptic may have still been on the loose and still finishing up its rampage. Once we rounded the corner, we were only greeted by another hallway, one that was nearly identical to the same one in our universe with only a few small differences, such as a pipe and tile placement. But none of that really mattered. What did matter, though, was the still barely alive agent at the end of it. He was fully geared up and dressed, just like us, but lying on his back in a pool of his own blood, with his rifle snapped in half lying next to him. We all rushed over to him, closing the distance in seconds. By the looks of things, it didn't look like he would be able to survive much longer. But at the very least, we would be able to get some info out of him about what had happened here. Although I or the rest of the team didn't recognize him as a doppelganger from our universe specifically, we still engaged him. I leaned down, wiping some blood away that was bubbling up in his mouth and dripping down his chin. "What happened to you?" I asked, attempting to use a somewhat soft tone towards the dying man. What did this? I could tell that he struggled with this answer. He was in no condition to really have a conversation of any kind. He tried to point behind me as if he wanted us to go that way. I turned and looked, only to not see anything of interest, besides several more mangled bodies of deceased agents. But I knew something did this to them, and it was still here. And with his choking gasps, I couldn't help but let him suffer any longer, so I made the decision that I thought was right at the time. "Melody," I said, looking up to her and nodding down at the dying agent before he slowly reached up and firmly gripped my arm with his left hand. But she didn't even have to figure out what it was that I wanted. She simply raised her weapon, pointed the barrel at the agent's head, and fired off a round to put him out of his misery. It would have had to have happened either way, but I had always been a strong believer that a quick death was better than suffering. Even if we did have the tools or ability to help him, we weren't allowed to, not with how fatally wounded he was. Once an agent was either mortally wounded or disabled beyond the ability to physically perform their job permanently, they were to be terminated. The higher-ups said that it cost a lot more money to keep the useless ones alive than it is to get rid of them altogether. Their words, not mine. Is this really worth it? We should probably have a few more agents here if we're gonna be dealing with something like this. Terrence spoke up. One of the Wendigos we kept for experimentation probably got loose. Melody responded. Besides, Jennifer will be pissed if we come back this early on. Before anyone could fire back, we all snapped to attention after hearing a brief but potent scratching noise coming from down the hallway in the direction that the agent had pointed to earlier on. What the heck was that? Terrence grilled, sounding agitated and demanding of an answer. Probably the thing that did this. Melody snapped, not taking her eyes off the hall. We should let it come to us, I suggested. We have the advantage by being alert and ready. Going down there and turning the corner could mean walking right into a trap. Let's split into groups of two. One duo goes down the hallway and the other watches their back, said Terrence. The scratching sound emerged again, this time seemingly being a bit closer to us. It sounded like it was coming from the ceiling, but looking up revealed nothing. And part of me thought that I was just losing it, and that this whole alternate universe thing was getting to my head. Oh, what was that right above us? Asked Ward, attempting to maintain a professional tone. It might be something in the vents, just keep your eyes peeled. If only it were that simple. I was afraid to admit that I was a bit unsettled. No matter how tough and hardened you are, the feeling of being hunted, being watched, and being stalked like prey will always scare you, at least a little bit. Yeah, about that splitting up thing, I'm gonna have to go ahead and say no on that. Safety in numbers, I pronounced. We all either have to move together or not at all, but we're not splitting up and asking to get ourselves killed. So we all moved forward as one, the scratching noise briefly popping up here and there above us. We all kept our line of sight locked in different directions just in case whatever it was tried to attack from a certain angle. But despite our best efforts and despite the fact I was comforted by the other agent's presence, I still felt like we were hilariously outgunned by whatever it was that was stalking us. I didn't let the team know that, of course. The last thing they need is their leader freaking out in front of them. Let's try to get somewhere more secure. This is too open and too vulnerable. We're sitting ducks in this hallway. I said in a tone that I dictated I was in no mood for debate. You think this version of the site has the safe room where they found Dr. West's bloodstains in our universe? Terrence inquired. Yeah, they should. Everything's been similar enough so far. If we can make it, we can try and hunker down until we can figure out a way to bait this thing and kill it. Bait me? Came a strange, bass-filled, monstrous, and just barely human-sounding voice from above, causing all of us to immediately turn off and fire our weapons, blasting whatever it was full of holes. But apparently it saw this coming, quickly darting across the ceiling and using the cover of the darkness and flickering lights to its advantage. From what milliseconds of glimpses I caught, though, it was big as far as height, but thin in width. Part of me had even thought it might have been an arachnid in nature. I hadn't gotten a good enough look to fully conclude. We ceased our fire. The logical solution would have been to put on our night vision goggles so we could see what we were fighting much better. But with the main lights flickering at inconsistent rates, we could potentially damage our eyesight. Not to mention they weren't even working to begin with. What in the heck was that? Ward cursed. His earlier display of confidence now fully faded away. But instead of being able to answer him myself, the mystery creature spoke up instead, that same commanding voice piercing through the hallway. I am what you wanted me to be all along. A weapon, it responded, this time coming from around the corner. Tough talk for something that hides, Melody shouted, attempting to maintain a sense of dominance in the situation. The only thing I ever hid was my hatred for you, for Dr. John, and every single human in this horrendous organization. The voice fired back, unaware that we weren't native to this version of the agency. However, it didn't take me too long to piece together what, or rather who, this voice belonged to. Someone that had been an important part of our operations years ago but had gone rogue. A creature created by the scientists in our universe Site-12 for the purpose of helping us hunt down and kill cryptids more efficiently.
Damn it.
Subject 16A.
I gained a level, that's good.
What did we ever do to you? We fed you, gave you a home, and provided with you all the resources you needed to survive. Sounds to me like you're just ungrateful, I cried out, attempting to agitate this alternate 16A so he would emerge. It was in our best interest to assume that he had similar abilities and strength to the one that we used to know. And if that was actually the case, we'd be more easily able to take him down. Judging by his comment about Dr. John, it appears that he had more than likely been the one to create him in this dimension, because in our reality, he had fled the agency with him and killed his creator, Dr. West. And we were two out in the open, and he could easily grab one of us from the middle of the hallway if he played his cards right. So I turned to the team, whispering about us marching in a formation that could allow us to watch every possible angle as we moved. Ward and Melody, you both watch the back angles. Terrence and I look out for the front ones. We move quickly but quietly. You understood? I said as quietly as can be, keeping my ears open. No, we need to go back. You really think this is worth it? Ward, a whisper shouted. He'll kill
What's
us,
up, man?
and this will be all for nothing.
Thanks for stopping by.
This mission ain't worth it. Nothing that we do is worth it. And you're an idiot for agreeing to even do this in the first place. What? You gotta impress your goddess, Jennifer, is that it? Ward, shut your mouth, I snapped. Just about being able to keep my voice at a whisper, despite my irritated state. You know you think you're so smart, but you're gonna be the reason that we all end up dead. Ward continued, only angering the rest of us. Ward, shut up. Melody stepped in, spit flying out of her mouth right before she gritted her teeth. I'm gonna make a run for her. And just before Ward could get his next word out, he was suddenly grabbed and snatched up towards the ceiling as the lights flickered, screaming and firing his weapon frantically and clumsily before it fell on the floor, causing all of us to come within inches of getting shot. Ward! I screamed as we immediately opened fire at the ceiling. It had all happened so fast. 1 second he was there and the next he was gone, pulled away like nothing more than a box of cardboard. I could hear his screams of pure terror and dread as what I assumed was 16A crawling along the ceiling with him in hand. I forgot just how fast and agile he was. It was clear that he had moved fast enough to evade our gunfire. Make it far enough away to chasing him would have only meant similar fates for the rest of us. Ward's fate was now out of our hands, as the three of us who still remained turned and halted down the opposite end of the hallway as his screams continued to fill in. But only for a few seconds. I could have sworn that I heard the sound of bone snapping, followed by a swift plunge back into silence, save for our footsteps and heavy breathing. Melody led the charge, but I wasn't far behind. Terrence took up the rear, but seeing as he was the biggest of us all, it wasn't surprising. The guy had packed on quite a bit of muscle in the past couple of years. For the time being, I'm not sure if 16A was in pursuit, but let's be honest. If he was, he would have already caught us long ago. In our universe, I had seen him outrun a Wendigo on more than one occasion, and those things are known for their speed. And the best thing to do now was to exit the building entirely. One of 16A's biggest combat advantages was his ability to scale nearly any surface and climb like a freaking spider everywhere. If we take him out of his element, we may have a better chance. Come on, I commanded, knowing full well that it was pointless to be quiet anymore anyway. We turned a corner and made it back into the main area of the building, finding the big double doors of the entrance. I stopped once a few feet away and shot the lock off the doors before having Terrence run and bash his way through them, quickly following him along with Melody without even looking up from the ground. But once I did, I realized that they were both beyond lucky, and potentially even more screwed than before. Outside our universe's facility, it's mainly a long, bare road with some forest behind the building. But this wasn't even close. This version of Site 12 was an island, a small but stable-looking one surrounded by strange murky water. If this universe had an ocean, then this couldn't have been it. Unless ocean water here had much more in common with swamp water than seawater. The sun was yellow, the sky was blue, and everything else seemed to be similar. Everything except for the water. Regardless, we all ran as far away as we could from the building. About a quarter of a mile there was a dock at the end of this side of the island, but with no boats in sight. But if we could at the very least hold out at the end of the dock and keep our guns pointed straight ahead, he wouldn't be able to get to us. But eventually, we did have to make it back to the portal. Not that he knew that. I caught a glimpse of something shiny slightly out of my left shoulder. After moving my eyes slightly in order to get a better idea of what exactly it was, I was able to mentally relax, but only a little bit. The substance was a dark blue, thick but runny liquid, about 6 or 7 drops worth. But it wasn't long before it clicked in my head as to where it came from. It was blood. Some of 16A's blood. Perhaps we had actually hit or struck him with a bit of gunfire after all. Although judging by how much there was combined with his healing abilities, it couldn't have been fatal nor serious. The rounds that we used were armor-piercing and very powerful. Our version of 16A was resistant to low-caliber gunfire, according to Dr. West, so I'm sure this doppelganger was no different. You shoot any normal man with the bullets that we use and he'll be turned into mush. But 16A could take a few shots without a crazy amount of pain or injury. I was huffing and puffing at this point in our escape, but running full speed and heavy equipment and tactical gear will do that to you. Luckily, we all just about had the stamina left to make it to the end of the dock. I turned around, looking for any leftover helicopters. I had no pilot or avian certifications, but heck, I didn't care. I'd try flying one regardless in this situation. But of course, luck was not on our side, so we stuck with the dock plan. Melody was the first one to recover and catch her breath after the whole running ordeal, raising her gun towards the facility in a slightly shaking manner. I followed suit next, mirroring her stance. Terrence, however, looked really out of it. He struggled to fully recover and was standing close to the edge of the dock as he inhaled and exhaled rapidly. And when I say close, I mean a little too close. So I turned to go help him while Melody kept watching the open field in front of us. I reached down around my mostly empty utility belt and grabbed my leather-wrapped flask filled with water, popping off the cover and reaching out to give it to him, as I attempted to nudge him away from the edge. Here, drink this. And that's an order. We need you strong, big guy. I told him firmly as he reached out for it, seemingly grateful for the offer. I never knew why only the leading agent got to have a flask of water on them during operations, but that was the rule that worried me the least in this organization. But just as his fingers gripped the flask, the dock suddenly and violently shook, causing both of us to lose our balance and fall right over the side. We plunged into the water, our rifles and gear coming with us. I heard Melody yell out for both of us, and for a moment I thought that would be it. That this strange, murky swamp water was filled with some alternate universe radiation that would instantly kill us, but no. For the most part, it felt and reacted like water usually did, although it was still incredibly hard to see. I was already 6 or so feet under the surface when I finally got a hold of myself. I looked down, seeing that Terrence had sunken even further in the nearly brown sea. I swam my way over to him, his lack of energy paradoxically keeping him in a panic state, as he kicked his feet and flailed his arms aimlessly. He was always a half-decent swimmer, but the intensity of the situation was overcoming his ability to think rationally. Once I had grabbed a hold of him, I kicked as hard as I could and maneuvered my way through the water, back up towards the surface. Taking another look down as I did, and being met with a mundane horror. I watched as Terrence and I's rifles sank deep into the abyss below, along with the flask of water, never to be seen or retrieved again. It was terrifying, staring down into what seemed like an endless void of an ocean that was potentially even deeper and more monstrous than the one I was familiar with. I was both fascinated and horrified, and not many things caused me to feel that so easily. But this wasn't your immediate adrenaline-inducing terror, no. It was deeper, worse, and almost cosmically horrifying. I sat there, looking down at my legs hung above what could have been miles and miles of an abyss below. An abyss that I couldn't even see a mere fraction of. I swam up, quickly snapping myself out of a little episode. I dragged Terrence with me, both of us breaking the surface and coughing up water before gasping for air. I looked back up at the dock, spotting Melody leaning over the side with a rifle next to her, holding out a hand for the both of us. By this point, I wasn't sure how long she had her eyes taken off the door, and if 16A had gotten the chance to exit the building and come barreling towards us. I reached out for her hand first. A team effort occurred between the two of us in order to pull me up, as I groaned and strained my arms to do so. My soaking wet gear making it all the more difficult to raise my weight out of the water. "Hey!" Terrence cried out, causing me to turn my head after I had made it back up onto the dock. I glanced out behind him, squinting my eyes to get a better look at what it was that he was pointing at. It didn't take me long to find it though, and when I did, I knew that we had to get him out of here as quickly as we could. About 200 meters or so out, I spotted a near comically colossal creature swimming in our direction. It had to be 30 feet long bare minimum, and that estimate only came from what I saw above the surface. Speaking of which, it was several feet wide as well, resembling that of a sea slug. An absolutely massive sea slug. Its back was a darker purple with long, pointy spikes that were white at the tips, sticking straight out nearly every few square inches. Water displaced and bubbled up as the creature swam right towards us. It didn't appear to be very fast, but I couldn't tell if that was because it was swimming slowly on purpose or because it didn't think that we had noticed it yet. Part of me wondered how it had known that we were here. Was it the splashing? Probably. But as I reached out to grab Terrence's hand, I realized what actually made more sense. 16A's blood was now gone from my shoulder. This thing had smelled it after it had been dispersed into the water, and now Terrence was in danger because of my clumsy decision-making. I wasn't actually sure what normal sea slugs ate. Probably not humans, but considering both the size and unnatural nature of this one, I wasn't going to take the chance. Once the creature was about 150 meters out, it dove under the surface and completely submerged itself. I ordered Melody to look down the scope of her rifle to keep an eye on it, while I began to pull Terrence up. She did right after checking the building to see if 16A had made his way over, and thank God he hadn't. I hoisted Terrence up high enough for him to be able to grab a hold of the dock himself, allowing Melody to turn her attention back to the building. Terrence coughed and hacked up a bit of water once he finally laid on the wood of the dock, but that was to be expected. We need to move away from the dock. With how big that thing is, it could easily lunge its way up here and grab one of us like we're a snack on the top shelf at the grocery store, I announced rather frantically, reaching down to my belt and pulling out my sidearm, a .50 caliber Desert Eagle pistol. Terrence copied my action after getting himself to his feet. He, Melody, and I all shared glances with each other as we all backed away from the edge of the dock, attempting to keep ourselves out of harm's reach. But it didn't matter, because by the time we were only a few steps away, the creature broke the surface once again, sending a thin wall of water our way. Surprisingly, it didn't throw itself onto the dock, but rather swim around it, only about 8 feet or so away. Now that it was up close, I got a better sense of scale as to just how massive this thing truly was. Although, I didn't want to find out how much more of its body was hidden beneath the murky water. I turned to Melody, who seemed confused as to why the creature hadn't attacked us yet, as it swam and circled the end of the dock like a shark. Was it sizing us up further? We got an answer. When a voice, a booming voice at that I could have sworn was only making noise inside my head, suddenly emerged. Was this thing speaking to me telepathically or something? I considered that being the case at first until I saw both Terrence and Melody react to it as well. There are no more vessels for this water. Your fellow humans took the rest and long ago. If you're trying to escape the blue creature, you're too late. Why would they run? That's not a part of procedure at all. When there's a breach, agents are supposed to stay and fight until there's no one left. Only Science and Finance Division employees get to leave immediately. Melody erupted. As much as I agreed with her, I was just stunned that this thing could talk coherently and intelligently like 16A. How many cryptids could? Not ones that I met anyway. Perhaps it didn't really want to violently tear us apart after all. I was blown away, and even though I was under the assumption that it was speaking to us telepathically, I still couldn't help but respond to it out loud. Are you here to hurt us? I inquired, hesitant to lower my weapon. If I am left unharmed, then no. But should you attack me, I would devour all three of you well thousands of feet within these depths. I held back the question that we all wanted to ask for a moment. I just wasn't sure how good it would sound to be recruiting a massive, unpredictable creature that I just met to help us kill one of the most dangerous cryptids to ever walk both this earth and ours. Can you help us? I paused for a moment. With killing the blue one. I know we look like the other humans you may have seen, but we've come from far away, and with him alive, we won't be able to get back home. He won't let us. I cannot leave the water if it is your desire to kill him. He will have to be brought here. The slug responded just before diving back underneath the surface, the resulting displacement of the water causing a small wave to crash up against the side of the dock. Terrence, Melody, and I all share an uncomfortable silence and glance around at each other. I knew what they were thinking, but I was the one in charge, and I was the one who needed to make sure that I stepped up. 16A could be harmed. After all, we made him bleed. He was fast, powerful, and smart, but not invincible. I reached out to Melody, giving her a look that I was in no mood to argue about what I was preparing to propose.
Death.
I need the both of you to stay here. I'm going to go back and bait him.
Jacked him up.
Are you kidding me? Terrence immediately erupted, gripping his gun noticeably tighter. He'll kill you in an instant. I flashed my eagle, giving a confident yet sarcastic smirk. If you encounter him, you'll have one chance at a headshot. If you miss or just wound him, he'll tear you apart. Melody argued. You can't go luring him over here alone. Thanks for the confidence boost. I clapped back, already beginning to head down the dock back towards the building. We don't have time for a council meeting. This decision is final. No, Terrence shouted after me. You have no chance. I didn't even look back before saying, being the one in charge has its pros and cons. I was well aware that there was a fine line between bravery and stupidity, and I had certainly crossed it. But regardless, I had a job to do and we couldn't stay here much longer. Because if we did, we'd be stuck here forever and left to fend for ourselves. But I ignored any further pleas from Terrence and Melody to stay behind with them. Once I made it within a reasonable distance of the building, I peered into one of the windows, seeing that 16A was already lurking behind one of them, staring me down with those eerie, light bulb eyes as I stopped right in my tracks. He was smart. A lot smarter than most would give him credit for, and for that very reason, I needed to use my head. Like Melody said, if he charged me and I didn't land a solid headshot, I'd be as good as dead. There was no way that I would outrun or outfight him in any universe. He had physical strength that would put a silverback gorilla to shame. and even that's a comical understatement. I know that we were too far away for him to even have heard our conversation with the giant sea slug, so he couldn't have possibly known about our little scheme. But by the look on his face through the glass, I could tell that he knew that I was playing at something.
Let's go.
As soon as I lifted my weapon and pointed it at the window, he darted upwards along the wall, next to it on all fours, and retreated into the darkness. He was waiting for me to come to him. I took a deep breath, gripped my eagle, and continued on, now feeling death practically exhaling down my neck. I got to the door,
Dude, watch out.
aiming my gun as I slowly peered around the corners and looked up at the ceiling.
It'd be nice if that was 4
I saw nothing at first, but it brought me no form of comfort. I scanned every wall, every surface that I could,
1,000 watch hours.
but he was far too skilled at keeping himself hidden.
Those things.
My adrenaline rush only increased further as I heard his voice coming from somewhere above, despite my inability to spot him. You've come to kill me, pathetic. For decades, I'm nothing but a vessel for your slaughter. A killing machine, as you all called me. And yet, simultaneously, I was nothing to you. After all your ridicule and countless attempts to make me feel small and weak. Now you cower in fear when I finally know just how strong I am. You all wanted a monster. He paused, just before a loud thud erupted through the building, followed by the sight of him landing on the floor around 15 feet in front of me. And now you have one. He was now in a bipedal stance, towering above me with his monstrous 8-foot height. His skin was a slightly lighter blue than the 16A from our universe, but his claws looked just as long and just as deadly. Speaking of which, they had a fresh coating of blood on them, blood that I was certain belonged to Ward. So, you kill, slaughter, and tear us all apart, and what now? When do you stop this march of death and destruction? 16A took a few steps forward, only stopping when I aimed my eagle's barrel right at his forehead, and rotated my pointer finger over to the side of the barrel, not daring to put it on the trigger in front of him. I wanted to take a shot and hopefully put him down right then and there, but he would be expecting it, and with his agility and speed, he was just at a far enough distance to where he'd be able to probably dodge it, and then I'd be toast. So we continued this little game of cat and mouse. I slowly backed away inch by inch as I attempted to keep him distracted with passionate conversation. I didn't want him to get the idea that I was intentionally trying to lead him away, but rather that I was attempting to escape out of fear for my life, which I'm sure he also had suspicions about. I find your attempts at chastising me for causing chaos hypocritical. You, the other agents, and Dr. John, from the moment of my inception to now, you've shown me nothing but hatred of violence and cruelty. Only Dr. West ever dared to show me compassion, and you all killed her for it, he growled, now raising a claw and spreading his hand, allowing the exposed parts of his fingernails to gleam in the dim light. At this point, I had backed myself past the door frame at a few feet inside. 16A once again moved forward and my hands began to shake. If I truly was going to take a shot, it was either now or never. I let out a breath, disguising it as me gathering my thoughts. I gripped the handle and I fired. The 16A had already started moving before I even finished pulling the trigger. He dropped to all fours and pounced over to me to close the distance, and in an instant, stood to his feet and grabbed the gun from my hands with his left claw, and crushed it like a marshmallow, just before grabbing me by the throat with his right claw, and raising me into the air like I was nothing more than a child's plaything. A shame. I considered even sparing you, but you are just like the rest of them, he said as I desperately gasped for a breath while he crushed my throat. And truth be told, I don't even think he had even begun consciously applying any pressure. The feeling of his claws just mere millimeters away from my jugular was enough to make sure that I didn't panic and get my own throat slit. But just before I was about to certainly meet the creator himself, a series of loud bangs rang out. Just before 16A roared in pain, and tossed me over to the side like a mere box of cardboard. I slammed into an outside wall of the building, and I was sure that I heard one of my ribs crack on impact. As I groaned, gripped my side, and turned my gaze over to the dock, 16A dropped to all fours and began sprinting his way right towards Terrence and Melody. I got up, running after them in a pained and limping manner. Of course, it was futile. There's no way that I would catch up to 16A, but I had to do something. I couldn't stay down, even if staying down meant that I didn't have to endure agony. He was hit a couple of times in what looked to be his lower body, slowing him down only a bit, but even still he moved at a speed that would eclipse a cheetah. I could feel Melody and Terrence's terror as he closed the hundreds and hundreds of feet of distance in mere seconds. He managed to evade most of the shots, but even in his slightly injured state, he kept on. The guy really could take a lot of punishment. Melody had run out of ammo in her rifle after failing to land any successful headshots, but she had no time at all to reload. Instead, she retrieved her deagle and began to aim it just as 16A was only a few dozen feet away. But it didn't matter. Terrence ran forward, attempting to shield Melody from the blue beast and fire off a shot with his own eagle. But even with how huge he was, he looked like a toddler in comparison to 16A, who quickly leapt up to a bipedal stance and backhanded Terrence with his left claw, sending the big guy flying nearly 20 feet off the dock and crashing back into the murky water with a violent splash. The giant slug appeared to not be coming to help us. Should have known better after all than to trust a cryptid. Melody fires off 2 successful shots into 16A's lower chest after he had maneuvered, causing him to roar and then lunge forward and snatch the gun from her before she could even react. He then turns and throws it at what looked to be a dang near mile away. The look he gave her after was nothing but deep-seated rage. I continued limping forward, my awkward run doing nothing to help the feeling that no matter what I did, I wouldn't be able to change the inevitable outcome of this horrible situation. Melody runs and attempts to jump off the dock and dive into the water, but instead was caught midair by 16A, who grabbed her by the back and proceeded to throw her several feet backwards onto the dock. She slid across the wood on her back, howling in pain as she reached down into her utility belt and grabbed an unidentified object that I couldn't make out at first. 16A dropped down and pounced over towards her before raising a claw, preparing to quite literally slice her apart like mincemeat. But when she raised the object up, only then did I realize what it actually was. A grenade, and one that she had already pulled the pin off of. 16A reacted like a frightened child, opting to stand, lean down, and quickly grab her leg with a claw before slinging her dozens of feet away off the dock and into the water. But I could see that just before 16A let go, she had purposely dropped it onto the dock. It was clear that little stunt was intended to save her life, rather than thinking it would have actually worked to kill him. 16A turned his head after watching Melody's body collide into the water, only to see the grenade was now right at his feet. He backed up as quickly as possible, only getting about 2 large steps away before it exploded, sending him flying back into the water as well, albeit still alive but now more wounded than previously. A chunk of the midsection of the dock had been blown apart, sending boards and logs into the water below. After several more seconds of my limped run, I finally made it to the edge of the dock, huffing and puffing to catch my breath while I held my side. Terrence had already broken the surface, seeing me holding my side and doing his best to get himself out of the water. "Did you see Melody down there?" I asked, genuinely wondering if she had sustained damage from such a harsh throw. "Yeah," he coughed, grabbing the top of the dock as he hoisted himself up. Melody emerged from the depths not too long after and began quickly swimming her way over with a bit of struggle. I saw a trail of blood following her in the water, indicating that 16A had cut her with his claws while in the midst of roughly grabbing and tossing her off the dock. "Hurry," I snarled, and Terrence bent down to help her out, seeing as I was in no condition to be straining myself past this point. After she was on the dock, I looked just where the source of the bleeding was, which had turned out to be her calf. The slash itself didn't appear very deep or serious, but I nonetheless pulled a cloth out from my belt and wrapped it around her wound, tightening it to stop the bleeding. "You're a heck of a fighter. Can you still walk?" I inquired, helping her stand up. She noticed me holding my side, allowing both me, her, and Terrence to all briefly brag that we had encountered one of the most dangerous beings ever and lived to tell the tale. "It stings, but yeah, I can manage. We need to hurry and get back to the gateway. We have less than 7 minutes." I, Terrence, and Melody, with a bit of a limp, all begin to quickly make our way toward the beginning of the dock, only to be stopped dead in our tracks by 16A, who had emerged from the water and leapt up onto the dock. It was clear that he had taken more initial damage from the blast than I thought. Starting from his right shoulder all the way next to his right eye, he had horribly charred skin, indicating burns from the heat of the grenade explosion, as well as what looked to be several cuts and gashes from shrapnel being blasted into him, which were on top of his several gunshot wounds. Now, while I think the damage he sustained would have killed any regular man several times over, he was obviously not a regular nor a man. He didn't waste any time with any monologues or speeches. Instead, he dropped down on all fours yet again, and prepared to lunge over the hole in the dock right next to us. And in that moment, I truly thought that was the end. With no significant weapons left to defend ourselves, we'd be toast. But just after he had leapt and was in midair, something rather shocking transpired. The giant sea slug bursted up from below like a bullet train, crashing and destroying even more of the dock as he did so while grabbing 16A right in his jaws, which were now revealed to have several rows of black teeth all shaped like jagged pizza cutters. 16A roared and cried out in pain as the sea slug thrashed around with him in his mouth. 16A clawed and lacerated the sea slug's face enough to draw blood, but it was admittedly pointless. Large amounts of 16A's blood began to pour down the sides of the sea slug's mouth, and it had been clear who was truly going to leave this encounter alive. The sea slug then retracts back down into the water below, bringing 16A with him, as we all watched like flabbergasted children. I leaned over, seeing the water below fill with a midnight blue color, a telltale sign that 16A was no more. Or at least, it wouldn't be soon enough. I guess you can trust cryptids after all, I uttered in pure shock but also grand relief. But we didn't have time to celebrate. We had to make it back. First by maneuvering our way around the now colossal hole in the dock with falling back into the water, and then booking it once we made it back onto the island itself. We all ran as fast as we could one last time, this time with Melody taking the rear due to her leg, but she was still able to move reasonably well. I turned back multiple times as we covered distance in order to make sure that she was still with us. Terrence was at the front while I still kept a hand at my side. 2 minutes, she bellowed, only making our hearts pump faster as we approached the building. Terrence waved us both in as we made it into the main doorway, immediately doing a quick turn to the right and running down the hall to the science wing. We passed a few ancient bodies that we hadn't seen the first time. Still more blood and weapons scattered about in the hallway, but there was nothing that we could do for them now. It wasn't long before we found the room with the gateway. It sat at the end of the hall, the symbol that we were almost out of this nightmare of an operation. We made it to the doorway of the room and turned the corner, feeling that same magnetic pull towards the opposite wall of the entrance. The gateway was becoming unstable. Papers, pens, and all sorts of objects going flying across the expanse of the room towards it. Come on, go, 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 I ordered, stepping to the side. I stayed behind, allowing both Terrence and Melody to go first, watching as they disappeared into the black void. I took one look back, cementing the fact that I was more than happy to leave this place of a universe behind. What happened here was nothing that we could change, but something told me it was a warning. A warning that things could have turned out much differently had certain events transpired with only subtle changes. I turned, jumping into the gateway and landing back into our reality with Jennifer, Dr. Garth, Terrence, and Melody all waiting for me, as well as a couple of extra scientists. Close it now. Jennifer ordered Garth and the other lab coats, who frantically typed away at a panel on the far side of the room and hit several buttons in a purposeful pattern. I leaned over the desk, where Jennifer was seated at, exhaling heavily as she looked at me with concern. "Where's Agent Ward?" was all that she could muster to ask. But the look that I gave her in response said it all, and she soon made the connection. A look of disappointment in her eyes. I knew that she wanted me to tell her more, to describe everything we experienced and saw. But for the moment, I could only say 4 simple words. Never open it again. This week's episode of Creepscast is sponsored by HelloFresh. Go to hellofresh.com/MrCreep16 and use code MrCreep16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 free gifts. Hello everyone, I hope that you're all doing well. Spring is officially upon us, and I'm sure like many of you, I'm welcoming the warm weather. With that, let's turn up the heat and dive into things as we drift further into Mr. Creep's mind. An entry from the Journal of an Artificial Human, written by Fallen Angel 41.
Thank you for the likes, you guys. I appreciate that.
My name is Lucy, and I'm 17 years old.
We're in this right now.
Now, don't let the title of this journal fool you. I am in no way, shape, or form a robot, but rather, I am one of the first 2 humans born using synthetic DNA. In other words, I am one of the first humans who doesn't have biological parents. This sounds like the technological and scientific marvel of the century. Heck, it almost won 2 guys a Nobel Prize, but what I'm about to tell you is going to change everything. Like I said earlier,
That was a bad move.
I'm only one of 2 humans made without parents.
Ran out
The other
died.
subject is a male, same age as mine. His name is Mark. Mark and I were synthesized using different proteins and chemical structures from various sources, which were then rearranged into a crude genetic structure. This took over 5 years to get just right, with various failures along the way. But eventually, they managed to create a viable DNA sequence, and from there, create variations of these sequences to act as chromosomes and such. After about 2 months of genetic tampering, these sequences were combined into a zygotic cell, and placed in a controlled environment nearly identical to the conditions of a human uterus. Over the course of 11 months, the fetuses began to grow. On May 8th, 2001, the first began to move on its own, and on July 14th, 2004, the first child was successfully removed from the controlled environment. It was indiscernible from a regular human infant, born under regular conditions. The only difference was an extended pregnancy due to the nature of the conception. These scientists, from what I hear, reacted like they had just created the first nuclear weapon. They had worked 5 years trying to create a zygote from scratch, and another 11 trying to incubate it, and their labor had finally paid off. Mark was the firstborn, I was the second. It only took about 15 months for me because by then, they had all the steps figured out from the first time. I was born on October 21st, 2005. Our early years were nothing eventful. We were named by the head researcher. Mark was named after the scientist's late son, who died in a car crash just 8 days after his 19th birthday. I received the name Lucy because the scientist in question had always been fond of the Peanuts comics by Charles Schulz, and wanted to honor him by naming a scientific marvel after one of his characters. We led the lives of normal human children, except we had 4 scientists watching us instead of moms and dads. We were raised in 2 separate apartments with 2 scientists each looking after us. Another thing, our skin was pale white. Not a tan peach color like normal white skin, but actually white, like paper. They would rotate positions once a month. Now that that's out of the way, let me begin by saying the rest of this story isn't for the faint of heart, or those who are triggered easily. The next set of journal entries takes place from June 2017 to November 2019. By this time, Mark and I had become very close friends, mostly due to our similar origins. He wasn't a brother, but more of a significant other, a soulmate. This sounds weird, I know, but there isn't a better way to describe our relationship. We genuinely loved and appreciated each other. We didn't know that at the time, as we were still very young, but we just couldn't stop thinking about each other. The scientists seemed to enjoy our little relationship. They found it adorable and heartwarming to see Mark and I bonding with each other. This, however, wasn't the case for every scientist. One scientist in particular, a woman in her 40s named Jacqueline, but Mark and I called her the Mosquito Woman because of how much she poked and prodded into our lives, despite our protest. She didn't approve of any of the decisions made by the scientists. She was very easy to anger and very opinionated about the experiment. We all thought she was just a jerk, but this ran deep and nobody knew it. On an uneventful evening in June of 2018, I was at his home. Like I said, we were raised right next door to each other in large, furnished apartments. It was getting late, and I decided to tell my observers that I wanted to head home. We gave quick goodbyes and then parted ways for the night. Recently, we had been given phones to text each other with. However, every app except texting and calling was locked out. I texted Mark at about 10:30, telling him that I was bored to tears. He sent a message back, suggesting that we spy on our owners. Being the innocent little twins we were at the time, I agreed. I waited until 1 a.m. and then slowly crept out of my room and towards the room of Dr. Smith, my male observer. We were each given male and female observers to simulate parents, and I leaned against the door, pressing my ear up to it. Inside, I could hear him typing away at his laptop as usual. After a while, the constant clack, clack, clack of keys on a keyboard got boring to me. I crept over to Dr. Lincoln's room. She was fast asleep, making a sound like an idling diesel truck. I softly giggled to myself and crept back to my room. I then texted Mark and asked of his progress. He didn't respond. Must have fallen asleep, I thought to myself. The next few nights came and went, and then I went to see Mark again. He greeted me, although he was noticeably jittery. He seemed worried, and I asked him about it, and he kept brushing it off. What really got my attention was normally when Miss Mosquito came out to check on him. He was noticeably a lot more nervous around her. I asked him, and once again, he ignored my questions. A few days later, a new scientist joined the research group. She was as kind and supportive as somebody could be. Her name was Dr. Miller, but she let me and Mark call her by her first name, Jane. Jane was a tall Korean woman about 32. She acted less like an observing scientist, and more like a caring mother. She was fluent in English, albeit with a bit of an accent. As you could probably tell, I couldn't hold back my excitement when she was assigned to me as my female observer. I ran up and hugged her, and she smiled and did the same. About a week later, Mark and I met up again. Mark was in rough shape now. There was a small discoloration on his left arm. Jane looked carefully at it, and he started sobbing before closing the door on us. I curiously texted him that night, and finally I learned what had happened to him. It had all started the night that we had spied on our caretakers. At the time, he had had the mosquito. He never expected that innocent game could go so awry. He had eavesdropped on his caretaker talking to another researcher, Dr. Smith, who we jokingly called the Wasp, for the same reason as the mosquito. What he heard that night shook his whole world. I don't know how much longer I can take watching him. Calm down, Jackie. Calm down. They're telling me to watch an abomination that they cooked up in a lab. If I want to study it, just put it in a cage. You and I both know that's not good for their mental health. The heck with their mental health. They're not even human. They're just as human as you and I. Ah, BS. All BS. That thing is not a human. It's a thing they cooked up in a lab. Sure, they made it, but it's human. A powerful slap is heard. Then you're no better than the people who made those godforsaken things. I'm sick and tired of the scientists here looking at that thing like it's human. It's not. It's unholy. Unholy. Are you aware of what your job is? You're a scientist, for God's sake. Even I have boundaries, and that thing is not a godly creature. I can't believe you. Then don't. Get the heck out of here. Have you lost your mind? We're in this together. We're a part of the same team. If you're not on board, why are you even here? I'm here because I'm stopping this right where it is. What happened after, judging by the sounds, was a fight. Furniture was broken, and it ended with Dr. Smith on the floor, sprawled out. Mark broke down in tears. Jacqueline came out of the room and picked him up by his neck, saying how he should have never been created. He managed to break free and run off, but then Jacqueline chased Mark down before stabbing him 4 times and throwing him out behind the building in a garbage bag. He came back inside and treated his wounds. Jacqueline managed to convince the rest of the team that Smith had tried to hang himself, and Mark ran away. She'd even planted evidence. Since he was a child, none of the team believed him. I was furious and I was horrified. After Jacqueline found Mark in his room, she began a 4-week-long cycle of physical and verbal abuse, and nobody said a thing. After a few days, as to not raise suspicion, I asked the lead researcher to move me and Mark into the same room. He thought long and hard about the decision, and to my surprise, he agreed. When I asked what had swayed his decision, he told me that Mark had also asked, and a few of the researchers, including Jane, had also lobbied for this decision. We were to be moved into a log cabin on the river.
What's up, everybody?
He chose the area because he liked the scenery.
Likes.
When moving day came,
Share if you can.
I opened the door to a bruised Mark. I hugged him tight. I couldn't stop hugging
Helps me
him.
get higher scores.
I cried and cried, saying that I felt sorry for him was an understatement.
I'm not
Jacqueline had stopped the attacking in fear of
Yes,
being
yeah.
discovered by one of the other scientists. However, it was only temporary, as I would soon learn. I will never forget the turning point of June 9th, 2019. I had woke up to a loud bang, like a balloon pop, but with a more solid crack. And then I heard it again and then again, as I realized what the sound was. My heart crawled up my throat. I crept to Mark's room. He was shaking and crying under the bed. I hid with him as a shadow down the hallway had approached us. It was Jacqueline, clutching a firearm in her right hand. The window in the bathroom had shattered, and shuffling inside was heard. 4 more people came in. They were wearing black hoods. Jacqueline reached out to one and gave the hooded figure a small bag. The figures then started searching the house. I shushed Mark and slowly led him to a vent. I tried to usher him in, but he couldn't fit. I then remembered a story that I heard about a Japanese prison break, and I gulped. I whispered my idea, and with tears in his eyes, he nodded. I slowly and carefully took my shirt off, and then wrapped it around his head. He bit down and clenched his eyes shut. I put his left shoulder against one of the legs of the bed. I grabbed his chest and upper arm, and put my legs against the bed frame. I kicked hard and a loud pop rang out. Mark yelled through the makeshift gag. It was horrible to look at, but it worked. I clenched my eyes shut in fear as I slowly began to set up his other arm. I kicked back again, popping the arm out of the socket. He cried, but he managed to keep quiet. I then pushed him through the vent. He could fit now. I followed him, pushing him by his feet. I don't know how long I crawled through the vent, pushing him along. I led him to the basement vent opening. I pushed him over the grate and then positioned myself over it. I looked at the fake nails and pulled one out. I started slowly unscrewing the grate. Once unscrewed, the grate fell, causing a loud bang. A figure ran in and unsheathed a knife. He grabbed my leg and I kicked and flailed, but he easily overpowered me. He grabbed my mouth, shushing me before sliding a knife across my neck. The pain was immense, but I had a plan. I fell to the ground playing dead. It worked. I slid my sock off, holding my breath. The room reeked of my blood. I could feel myself losing my grip on life. I wrapped the sock around my neck to stop the bleeding, and I wrapped my other sock up the same way. I was softly crying. Mark dropped down, landing on his dislocated arm. He howled in a shout of pain and crawled over to me. He put his arms out and then slowly pushed the joints back in. He groaned through clenched teeth, before weakly crawling over to me. He held my neck to help with the wound. What came next doesn't come easy to me, since I was losing a lot of blood. I remember him smashing the basement window and practically throwing me out. I remember weakly telling him not to call 911 and to call Jane instead. He nodded and told her to bring a baseball bat, telling her that we had been attacked. I blacked out a bit after that. I woke up in a white room, my neck wound sealed shut with hidden stitches. I could hardly breathe without coughing. I felt like the wind had just been knocked out of me. I was a bloody, crying mess. Mark lay next to me in a separate bed. He was asleep, and I saw the door handle twist, and Jane walked in. He was crying, and he hugged me tight. She was thanking everything there was for me being okay, and I later learned what had happened from Jane. As it turns out, the woman who tried to kill us wasn't Dr. Jacqueline. The real Dr. Jacqueline had been murdered in her sleep by an anti-scientific group known as The Journey. That's who came after me. The woman was actually named Rebecca Miller. She had a warrant for grand theft auto assault, and after the incident, 2 charges of murder in the first degree. I've never been happier to see the red and blue flash of a police car. The experiment has since been suspended, and Mark and I have been adopted by Jane and her husband, Kim. They're the greatest parents that I could have asked for. Due to the non-traditional origins of Mark and I, we receive a special income from the government of $200 a month, and we don't have to attend school in person. Instead, we are enrolled in an online course. I still have the scar on my neck, and I cry every time I think about it. Mark has grown up to be a supportive, gentle person whom I love dearly. Now I know this probably isn't the story that you expected. You probably thought it was something about a killer robot or a crazy genetic abomination that took out anything that moves. But I'm here to tell you that we don't need tales of the supernatural or the paranormal to frighten your children at night. The scariest things that we can ever overcome are ourselves. As a last note, I love and support everyone who has helped me through my trouble. I can't thank you enough. I'd like to thank HelloFresh for being a continued sponsor of Creepscast. In case you guys haven't heard, HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit, providing farm-fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes that get delivered right to your doorstep. It makes home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. I've been loving my HelloFresh subscription. My favorite part is that you can pick what you're in the mood for from their 50 different weekly options. You can even skip weeks when you need to, change delivery dates, or update your preferences all in the convenient HelloFresh app. And on top of that, Green Chef is now owned by HelloFresh, and with a wider array of meal plans to choose from, there's something for everyone. I mean, a couple of nights ago I whipped up some creamy pesto chicken that they had sent, and I'm not kidding you guys when I say it tasted like restaurant quality. It's awesome that it's so affordable and delicious to boot. Go to HelloFresh.com/MrCreep16 and use code MrCreep16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 free gifts. Again, that's HelloFresh.com/MrCreep16. Use code MrCreep16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 free gifts. Thanks again to HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. What we found underneath Berlin. Written by C. Farlow 7.
Damn, I'm getting my ass kicked right now.
I'm a World War II historian. I served in the United States Air Force as an F-16 pilot in the 149th Fighter Wing in San Antonio. My grandfather was a P-51 pilot and got to see the skies of Germany during the Great War. He would tell me stories as a kid about how Germany was so technologically advanced with the development of the jet engine and near impenetrable tanks. His stories are what inspired me to serve and follow in his footsteps. Once I finished my service, I became a historian, as World War II has always piqued my interest. I was spending a month in Berlin trying to find and excavate Nazi bunkers, foxholes, whatever we could find. My team consisted of 2 of my military colleagues that served right alongside me, a weapons expert, my son, and myself. Sam and Alan served as my wingmen whenever we were overseas, and they also shared my interest in the history of what happened back in the 40s. And Jack was a weapons expert who specialized in Nazi explosives and weaponry. My son Mark had just finished up high school and wanted to enjoy what he thought was a vacation. Upon the ugly surprise that this was work, he was mad, but he also quickly got interested in this line of work. After 2 weeks of grueling work and nothing to show for it, Mark suggested that we take a break and go explore a secret cave we found not too far from camp. We had the equipment for such a trip, and a little fun definitely could not hurt us. The next day, we got all of our equipment together, and we prepared for our cave expedition. For whatever reason, I was slightly unnerved as I tried to look up this cave, and I couldn't find anything on it. It was as if it didn't exist. I just brushed this off as thinking the locals have just missed a spot, and we left for the cave with Mark leading us. We traveled to what looked like a boulder in the middle of a forest, and Mark said that we were there. Everyone and I were looking at him in confusion, but he laughed and moved a big chip of the boulder away, and a giant cavity opened up under us. The first thing that I noticed was how dark it really was. The cave looked like it didn't have a bottom to it. Sam grabbed a flare from his backpack and dropped it down the hole. Surprisingly, it didn't drop too far until it hit the bottom. It looked around 30 feet deep in total. We got our rope ready, and we went down into the cave. Once further down, we could go left or right. We played rock, paper, scissors, and the winner got to choose. I have never lost a game of rock, paper, scissors, so I chose right. I deeply regretted this decision, as the cave soon sloped downwards at an alarming rate. It was rough, but not bad enough for us to turn around. After about an hour of descending, we started hearing this strange, metallic, clanking noise. Once we heard the noise, we all stopped, our hearts almost beating out of our chest as we thought, what could it be? We continued advancing, noticing the noise was in a stationary position. As we went deeper, it got louder. We kept continuing on deeper into the cave, and we were starting to see man-made marks on the wall, as if someone with a pickaxe had just went at it. This was later confirmed as we found a pickaxe head covered in rust. This made me ecstatic, as we could have just found an unknown labor camp used by the Nazis. It would be my first major find. A loud bang woke me out of my stupor, as I realized the noise was right around the corner. My heart racing from the adrenaline of fear and excitement, I turned the corner and almost crapped my pants. A huge 7-foot steel door stood 10 feet away from me, opening and closing, making that loud, metallic bang that we had all heard. I took a sigh of relief before I realized what I had just discovered. I had blacked out as the next thing I remember is Alan waking me up on the cold stone floor. None of us could believe it. We had just found a secret underground base untouched for decades. Or so we thought. Mark was just as excited as I was, as he just stared in awe at the crudely constructed middle door. Jack took a closer look at the door and realized that it was indeed German. Not to our surprise, of course, but what he said next made our excitement turn into fear. Guys, there was a huge explosion that blasted the door open. Could have been a booby trap, Mark replied, suddenly sad at the fact that we may not have been the first to find this place. Sam took a step inside cautiously, and immediately turned around and vomited. Inside the door was a room that resembled an airlock, but 2 scorched bodies lay in the middle of the room. Beyond the resemblance of a human, the only way we knew what they were was by the hand of an unfortunate soul blown across the room with a ring on the finger. The inside of the ring had an inscription: Darla, my love, 1984. Well, I guess we know when they got married, but when did they get here? Alan said. I'm no expert, but the untouched hand looks like it has been here for over a decade. This was true as to how many bits of flesh and bone remained. Jack chimed in saying that this must have been some serious firepower for an explosion to knock over a door as big as this one. We all spent time in silence, and then Sam said, look guys, we need to report this in. I don't like saying this, but there's no telling what other traps there are. This is by far the coolest thing I have ever participated in, but I don't want to lose my life because of it either. I was infuriated at the thought, knowing good and well the German government would shut this place down and destroy everything to bury their tainted past. Almost in a scream, I said, over my dead body. Jack came to Sam's rescue, but Sam, Alan, and myself all agreed that we need to learn more about this place, as it really could be our only chance. Sam and Jack reluctantly agreed, as I apologized for my previous behavior. We all voted Jack as the lead of our 5-man group, as he knew the field of booby traps used by the Germans. After a while, we reached the end of the square room, as the identical door from the other side stood at our wake in attention. Luckily, we got the door to open up with ease, but the lack of signs saying where we were and where we were going began to make us nervous. When we opened the door, we were surprised to see that the facility still had electricity, as the lights were all flickering ominously. There was a hallway. In this hallway were 10 doors, 5 on each side. Between every door was a rectangular window that led into the room. Looking into the moss-ridden glass of the first door on the right, with the lights in the room off, I shined my flashlight inside and noticed that it looked eerily like a hospital room. The room looked like it contained a stretcher and some movable trays with syringes on them, unused by the look of them. We tried to open the door, but it seems as if it was jammed shut. The rooms in the entire hallway contained the same thing, until the third one on the left. Inside was the same thing, but a human skeleton lay on the table. I was terrified, as I noticed these scratch marks on the side of the wall, as whoever this was tried to dig his way out using nothing but his hands. Beside his bony fingers lay an empty syringe. My imagination went crazy, and I wanted to know what was in the syringe. Were the Nazis testing drugs? Was it human psychology experiments? Strength supplements? The list went on and on in my head, until Mark came over to us saying that he had opened up one of the doors. Inside the room was a pungent smell, but to my satisfaction, there was a syringe full of red liquid. I stuffed it into my backpack as we ventured further into the hallway. The rest of the rooms were empty or had nothing noteworthy, unfortunately. Once we had reached the end of the hallway, there was another 30-foot hallway with what looked like an elevator at the tail end of it. On the left side was a door that had German written on it at one point, but it had eroded to the extent that none of us could properly read it. We spent around 5 minutes getting the door to open up due to the old and rusted hinges. We opened up the door to find what looked like a security office. Computer monitors were covering a wall with switchboards on the other side. We were also welcomed to the sight of 3 skeleton remains of what seemed to be these security guards. I quickly identified them as SS officers by their uniform, but each had one thing in common: a gaping hole in each one of their skulls. Alan calmly stated, "Well, I guess we know how they died. Either they did it to themselves or somebody got to them." We decided on the former because there was no sign of a struggle. But hey, none of us were forensic scientists, so it's honestly still up for debate. After a long moment of silence, we weighed the pros and cons of leaving this forsaken base and never returning. Alan, Sam, Jack, and I have seen some things that no man should ever see, as we had all served in the military. But this made all of our past experiences feel like childhood memories. We were starting to leave until Mark realized that the elevator had collapsed many years ago, and we could take the ladder down or up to see what the main reason for this base was. After some thought, we realized the opportunity that we almost wasted, and we all decided to go further into the dark abyss. We descend for what seemed like hours until we reach another door. Looking up, I realized that it was only about 100 feet away from where we had entered the shaft. But I already knew that we were deep in the earth to begin with, and going deeper concerned me. And I could tell that it concerned my colleagues as well, but we were too far now. I know that if I left now, not knowing what is down here would haunt me for the rest of my life. We slowly opened the door, and we were shocked and surprised to see a large open hangar. It was filled to the brim with aircraft, some that we recognized and some that we didn't. This captured our attention for about 5 seconds, as we soon noticed right next to the elevator shaft was what looked like a defense position. There were sandbags piled 3 feet high, with German machine guns perched on top of it. Horrifyingly, there were 5 skeletons in uniform sitting in chairs next to the sandbags. Red was splattered all around the walls behind them. Before we could even comprehend what had happened to them, we heard a blood-curdling scream. From the corner of the hangar, we saw a hangar door open, and a young blonde woman came and ran right into us. She was speaking so fast in a language that I didn't recognize. It had a hint of German, but I couldn't directly translate. The only thing I understood was the word monsters. Right after she had said that, she took a pistol off one of the dead soldiers and sealed her fate herself once and for all. Right in front of us, the red splattering all over Alan, who was now puking. I grabbed a hold of the pistol and a grease gun left behind by the other soldiers as everyone else followed suit. I didn't care if this was the find of the century.
Wow.
It was not worth my life or the lives of my friends. At this point, we all silently agreed to return to the surface and report this all to the authorities. I turned around to take one last glance at the marvelous architecture and then engineering feat when, out of the door where the girl ran from, came two soldiers dressed in World War II SS uniforms. Only they didn't care about us, or even notice us for that matter. They slammed the door shut only for it to be blown off its hinges by an unknown force. Their bodies crashed into a place that I didn't recognize, as their remains were ground to a pulp from the force. I stared in shock to see what could only be described as Satan himself. I can't even really put it into words. The creature, or whatever it was, stood at least 8 feet tall, had horns sharp enough to penetrate anything, scaled skin, and red eyes that could literally penetrate your soul. I was frozen in fear as the creature looked my way. For what felt like hours, we were in a staring contest until the creature gave up and went back into the hallway. Relieved that my pants were still dry, I noticed that I was the only one left. The others must have fled and climbed back up the shaft. I followed, and while climbing the shaft, I was almost hit by a body that was unrecognizable to me. It screamed as it fell into what seemed like a bottomless pit. I heard Sam and Jack scream, and I climbed up the ladder as fast as I could, and I saw Jack and Alan in hand-to-hand combat with what I could only describe as zombies. My first thought was, oh, of course, Nazi zombies are finally real. But this thought soon passed me as I noticed Sam on the ground next to a pool of blood. His face looked pale as the veins in his body bulged and slowly turned a tint of purple. As if he was in immense pain, he was screaming and writhing until he grabbed the pistol that he had taken earlier, and he took his own life as well. The sound from the explosion brought me back to reality, as I noticed about 20 zombies running full speed towards me. I quickly raised my grease gun and said a quick prayer that it would fire, and to my surprise it did. I aimed for the head as what popular horror culture teaches us, but I missed a couple of shots and hit them in the torso, and it seemed like that did the trick as well. I emptied my clip as Alan, Jack, Mark, and myself all take a breath and inspect our handiwork. We counted 48, including the one that fell in the shaft. "Where the heck did they come from? I thought we already checked this hallway," said Mark. Jack said somberly, "I don't know, nor do I care. Just someone help me take Sam back home." Alan, being the strongest of us all, grabbed the body of our now dead comrade and we jogged toward the exit. We reached the airlock and found the door that was broken shut and locked. A light came on in the room, illuminating 4 soldiers in uniform and what looked to be an officer. "English?" "No, American," replied Mark. "Ah, so I see you found your way into one of the 4 Reich strongholds. Very interesting seeing as how we had to dispose of the 2 so-called YouTubers. But we cannot let you go for obvious reasons." I piped in saying that people know where we are, and that the US government had been tracking us, hoping that he wouldn't catch my bluff. He disregarded what I said, and then he said, "Claus, give our guests a tour of the facility. The older one might find it very fascinating, as he only explored the abandoned part of the base. Let us fix our bridge and then take them on a VIP tour." My son Alan, Jack, and the corpse of Sam are now locked inside the airlock. We can hear screaming and gunfire. "Someone please send help. Send the whole United States frickin' Marines. The Nazis have opened up a portal to hell, and they are negotiating with the devil. God help us all." I used to deal drugs, but now I deal demons instead. Written by Beardify. My papa ran moonshine and he drank it too. Me drained till he drove his family away and put himself into an early grave. I left at 16 and swore that my own kids would never grow up thinking of their father as a dealer or an addict. But it's the truth. 6 months ago, I started using the same oxy that I sold for a living. And I'd seen enough pellets to know that it was only a matter of time before my life crumbled like a house of cards. I tried everything. Doctors, rehab, even locking myself in an abandoned cabin up in Pawpaw's Holler. Nothing worked. Until I found Reverend Elijah Bledsoe. He cured me with a single touch, and I'll stay cured, as long as I follow the orders. The Lord giveth, the Reverend said, with a knowing little smile, and the Lord taketh away. Before I got hooked, I thought that I had saved up enough to leave pill running behind forever. Now I'm on another continent, living on the charity of the church, and I'm starting to think that the tasks assigned to me here are even more dangerous than dealing. Reverend Bledsoe didn't tell me everything all at once. He upped the dosage slowly. At first, it was just clearing drug dealers off the streets and around the mission. It was violent work, and it made sense why he'd been looking for a guy like me to do it. But then my orders got stranger. Follow the dealers. Report any sudden changes in their appearance or behavior. Any unnatural weather events or power outages that occur nearby. The Reverend was asking me to look for something without telling me what it was. And by the time that I finally found out, it was already too late. I had just finished giving my report to the Reverend in his study, a bunker-like room in the basement of the mission that looked like it had been built to survive a nuclear war. Bledsoe had added a Turkish carpet, wood furniture, bookshelves, and warm golden lamps. But they didn't take much away from the grimness of the place. Reverend Bledsoe took his personal Bible from the inner pocket of his suit. He opened it and pulled out what I had thought was an illustration, but was really a cleverly hidden card, like the tarot cards my hippie aunt used to mess around with. It had this odd design in the back, like a closed eye inside of a hand. Do you know what this is, Brother Andy? Have you ever seen the Aids or any of the others with something like this? I wasn't sure. I need you to find a young man from the neighborhood. A young man without much to lose, without many connections. I'm sure you know the sort that I mean. I did. I had been that sort of young man before, too many years ago. You need to collect something from him. Hair, fingernails, spit, blood, it doesn't matter. Burn it, pour the ashes over the card, and recite the words that I give you. Maybe you'll notice some changes right away, maybe not. Send him to a club called Das Exil. You should ask for Conrad. Tell a young man not to leave until he has 3 other cards like this. I followed my orders. I didn't notice any of those mysterious changes the Reverend had talked about. Just one. When the blonde skater punk I had chosen to complete the task came back with more of those weird cards, I could tell by his face that this Conrad guy was dead. It's been a week since then. I hope to put all that strangeness behind me, but yesterday night, Reverend Bledsoe called me back down to his study. I need you to make an exchange for me. The Reverend placed the 3 cards I had retrieved into an envelope. You'll receive 3, just like it. Check them carefully. The cards felt heavy in my hand, like their menace gave them extra weight. I stood to go. Oh, and Brother Andy. Bledsoe grabbed my arm. If the opportunity should arise to leave with all 6 cards, take it. Reverend Bledsoe forced me to take a paper map, one of those fold-out things for tourists. I felt like a fool trying to read the soggy thing beneath the streetlights in the late March rain, but it was my only option. Ever since I started carrying the Reverend's envelope, my phone had started acting all buggy, and that wasn't all. Occasionally, nearby lights would flicker or even go out, like some great darkness was walking with me through the rainy night. The Reverend's map led me to a rundown warehouse district, the kind of place where the only living things were weeds and stray cats. At least we wouldn't be disturbed, I hoped. Delivery warehouse, side door B. It swung open as soon as I got close. Stepping into the huge, empty space was like stepping into the belly of some monstrous sea creature. 3 men stood behind a table.
Hey,
A
what's going
single
on?
red candle was the only source of
I think you
light.
have to have 3,000.
It made me think crazily of
How you doing, man?
ambushes, night vision goggles, knives in the dark.
They gave me
I
a mobile
sauntered up to
stream
the
key, but
table
they
with
haven't given me a
confidence
real one.
that I didn't feel, and I laid down my envelope. Without a word, the man on the other side reached inside of his jacket, and my hand instinctively reached for the pistol that I no longer carried.
My other
He
cat
took
got
out an
cancer.
identical envelope and passed it across the table to me. It held 3 cards like the one that the Reverend had given me. I gasped when the man across the table took the cards that I had given him and passed them one by one through the
I'm close
flame
to
of the
getting a
candle.
stream key on that one.
They should have burned, but they didn't. He bent them, tore at them, but they were completely unharmed. It was some kind of test. I frowned and did the same with the cards that the stranger had given me. As each card passed through the flame, I heard something in my head, a kind of excited whispering, like something caged that was eager to get free. I stuffed the cards back in their envelope as quickly as possible, and that should have been it. Just like so many deals in rest stops and parking lots all up and down the I-75 back in the USA,
Sona's better than me.
wordless
Yeah.
goodbye, see you never. Gunfire shattered the silence. Red stains bloomed like flowers on the yellow, soaked shirt of the
there you
man
go.
across the table. I hit the ground as more shots rang
They're
out.
not better. It's just
Something
Fucking
slammed
not
into the
fair.
table.
how the hell?
The candle went out. I crawled behind some shelves, and the stranger's ragged breathing and the running footsteps of our attackers was ringing in my ears. The stranger was dying. That much was clear, but he wasn't going quietly. He whispered something under his breath, over and over in a language that I didn't understand. Biezaliel, Biezaliel. Gusts of cold, dusty wind began to blow toward the dying man behind me, but I was too busy trying to stay alive to worry about the weird indoor weather. I kept moving on my hands and knees toward where I hoped the wall would be. I was crawling blind through a maze of broken wooden pallets, cardboard boxes, disused equipment. When 5 flashlights lit up behind me, I knew that I was screwed. The brilliant beams of light were military grade, and in their glow I could see that I had been scrambling in the wrong direction. The wall with its emergency door was too far away. I would never make it without being seen, and if I ran, they would gun me down for sure. I thought of Lee, the look on his face the first time that I took him fishing, and then Amber eating a huge plate of pasta at the kitchen table after her track meet. So many memories, and here I was, about to lose them forever. But the attackers weren't looking in my direction at all. Their flashlights were fixed on the spot where the stranger had fallen. The darkness there was thicker. It seemed to drink up their light. The Reverend had preached about the pillar of fire in the book of Exodus. But this was a pillar of shadow, and the bullet-ridden stranger was moving inside of it. He rose jerkily, unnaturally to his feet, almost like a human-sized puppet. I wondered what was pulling his strings. He shouldn't have been able to crawl so fast, not after 3 shots to the chest, and the darkness shouldn't have moved with him. The glow of the nearest attacker's flashlight disappeared into it. Panicked gunshots, a scream, and then nothing. The other attackers trained their beams on the moving darkness with no effect. The thing inside was coming for them, one by one, and when it was done, I could see its handiwork in the wild, rolling beam of a fallen flashlight. These men had been trying to kill me just seconds ago, but I still felt sick when I saw how they had been twisted. They were bent and broken until not one limb faced in the right direction. Their shrieks finally got me moving. Just when I was about to sprint for the door, I heard Reverend Bledsoe's voice. If the opportunity should arise to leave with all 6 cards, take it. The flashlights on the floor continued to spin, casting freakish shadows through the huge warehouse. I caught a glimpse of the knocked-over table, the snuffed-out candle, and the plain-looking envelope beside it. There was a burst of sound, something scrambling unnaturally fast on all 4s off to my left. I grabbed the rolling flashlight and ran for the fallen table. A wall of night stepped between me and it. The light in my hand had lit up the warehouse in front of me, but suddenly, I could barely make out shadows a few feet ahead. Cool fingers came out of those shadows. They wrapped around my forearm and snapped it like a twig, and I knew they wouldn't stop there. I could feel their excitement, their eagerness to mangle me more. I couldn't see the stranger's face, but I aimed for where it should have been and stabbed forward with the flashlight. Beelzebub, I cried out, not knowing why. A shriek pierced the darkness and I passed through it. I threw the flashlight as far as I could. 2 fast, crawling stabs chased after it as I crept through the pitch-black warehouse toward the door. My shin slammed against the table. The stranger's envelope.
Walk all the way into the base?
I felt around on the concrete floor until I grabbed a hold of it. An angry, guttural roar and the echo of a shelf being ripped down let me know that the flashlight had been found. I was out of time. I ran my shoulder into the door and burst out into the night. Distant sirens told me someone had finally heard the gunshots going on. I smirked in spite of the pain from my broken arm, wondering how the authorities would explain what was inside of that warehouse and what wasn't. There would be no sign of the thing that had shattered those men so horribly. I knew that because, as I staggered back toward the mission, I took one last look over my shoulder. The stranger, or the thing inside the stranger, stepped out through the delivery door. Its movements were much less jerky now, more natural. It snapped its twisted neck casually back into place and closed its suit jacket over the bloodstains on its shirt. Its eyes met mine, and for a second they were no longer the sad brown eyes of the stranger from across the table. They were the color of ink, with pupils as white as an arc welder's flame. The next thing that I remember, I was pushing my face off of the wet, nasty sidewalk with only one working arm. I'd fainted. The thing wearing this stranger's skin walked calmly away in the opposite direction, laughing to itself, laughing like a condemned man finally set free. The streetlights above it flickered out, one by one, as it passed. When the time comes, don't believe the local news. Written by Toucan the Rapper. The title says it all. I don't care what the doctors, teachers, police, my parents, or anyone else in this crazy town says. There's no such thing as spontaneous human malnutrition. And come on, you probably haven't even heard of it. Well, no, of course you haven't heard of it. It's not real. Spontaneous human malnutrition, or SHM. Those 3 letters didn't just ruin my last year of middle school. They ruined my life. It's like every adult in town has gone mad.
We got it.
People don't just... they don't. How do I even begin? It started during the lockdowns, and it wasn't until the 5th or 6th case that the local news started putting the pieces together. That's 3 weeks after Grant and I started our
We're gonna
investigation.
push this thing.
We knew something was up from the 3rd victim. Why? Because the 3rd victim was Doug's mom. Doug is, or was, the 3rd member of our cafeteria loser musketeer setup. When his mom, when whatever SMH actually happened to her, she was in the background of our weekly D&D Zoom session. Doug was shaking dice and praying to the nerd gods for a critical, when a weird noise came from his audio. It was barely half a second long, almost too quick to notice, but it was loud. Like really loud.
Game over.
So loud that Doug jumped a few inches into his seat and dropped the dice. Grant and I never found out if Doug hit that crit. His blonde bowl cut whipped away from the screen before we heard the clattering of dice on polished wood. Me and Grant didn't really care too much about killing cave trolls anymore, though. Both of us were glued to the screen, playing out in Doug's kitchen. The noise had come from Doug's mom. She had stumbled into shot, clutching the kitchen sink. She was vibrating. Not trembling, not shaking, vibrating. The motion didn't seem to be coming from any of her muscles. It was rapid jolting like that caused by pneumatic tools rather than fits and convulsions. She had fallen to the floor by the time that Doug had reached her, totally rigid and still jittering so fast that her form on my screen was barely more than a blur. From the angle, I couldn't see too much of what was going on. I saw Doug reach down to touch her, heard him yelp in pain, started yelling along with him when he recoiled and held up these stumps where his fingers had been. My speakers screeched at the moment he made contact.